Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're listening with the lights low, maybe you're lying in bed, maybe you have this playing quietly while the rest of the house has gone still, and tonight we're going somewhere that many people think they already understand. Not to a battlefield exactly, though there will be war in this story. Not to a presidential office exactly, though presidents will pass through it. Not to one famous concert or one famous march or one famous photograph of young people with flowers in their hair. Tonight, we're going into the long uneasy moment when millions of young Americans looked at the country they had inherited and said, in one way or another, this cannot be all there is. The story is the 1960s counterculture, but I want to be careful with that phrase because it can sound smaller than what it really was. When people hear counterculture, they often picture beads, long hair, guitars, tie-dye shirts, protest signs, incense, communes, psychedelic posters, and crowded parks full of young people who seem to have decided together that shoes were optional and authority was suspicious. And yes, all of that belongs somewhere in the story. The clothes mattered, the music mattered, the hair mattered more than it probably should have, at least to the parents watching from the kitchen table. But beneath the surface, beneath the fashion and the slogans and the smell of marijuana drifting through college dormitories and city parks, there was something much deeper happening. A generation was rejecting not just a set of rules, but an entire definition of a successful life. That is the part I want us to sit with tonight. Because rebellion is easy to turn into a costume after enough time has passed. History does this all the time. It takes complicated people and reduces them to an outfit. It turns anger into a poster. It turns fear into a song lyric. It turns a decade into a mood. But the people who lived through the 1960s did not experience it as a mood. They experienced it as a series of choices, pressures, shocks, disappointments, risks, arguments, and awakenings that arrived one after another until ordinary life no longer felt as stable as it had once appeared. The young people who became part of the counterculture were not born wanting to be symbols. They were born into ordinary houses, new suburbs, crowded apartments, military towns, church-going neighbourhoods, factory cities, and college campuses. Many had parents who had survived the Great Depression and World War II. Many had grown up being told they lived in the luckiest country on earth at the luckiest moment in human history. Many believed that for a while, and then they began to notice the cracks. If you were born in America in the years after World War II, the adults around you had a very specific story about what life was supposed to be. The country had defeated fascism. The economy was expanding. New houses were rising in neat rows outside cities. Refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, cars, vacuum cleaners, and suburban lawns became signs that the future had finally arrived. Millions of families who had known hardship in the 1930s and sacrifice in the 1940s now wanted peace, order, comfort, and predictability. They wanted the children to be safe. They wanted the sons to go to college or find good jobs. They wanted the daughters to marry well, keep decent homes, and raise healthy children. They wanted quiet streets, clean kitchens, dependable incomes, and a nation that made sense. There is nothing strange about that. After 2 decades of economic collapse and global war, wanting calm was not shallow, it was human. A father who had crossed Europe in uniform did not come home dreaming of chaos. A mother who had rationed sugar and saved tin cans and read casualty lists in the newspaper did not want her children to grow up suspicious of everything. The adults of the 1950s often believed that conformity was not oppression but protection. A steady job protected you. A respectable appearance protected you. A proper marriage protected you. A good neighbourhood protected you. Faith, patriotism, manners, and obedience were not just social rules. They were walls built against the disorder that older Americans had seen with their own eyes. But here is the problem. The children raised behind those walls did not always experience them as shelter. Some began to experience them as a room with no open window. I want you to imagine for a moment a teenager in 1960. Not a famous one. Not someone whose name will appear in a textbook. Just a 17-year-old sitting at a dinner table in an American suburb, maybe in California, Ohio, New Jersey, Illinois, or New York. The house is warm. There's food on the table. There's a television in the living room. There's probably a car in the driveway, maybe even two if the family's doing well. On the surface, this is exactly what success was supposed to look like. The parents are proud of it, and they have reason to be. But the teenager is looking at the same scene and feeling something that is difficult to name. Not hatred, not yet, not even clear disagreement. Just a quiet suspicion that the life being handed to them has already been decided before they were ever asked. The father may be speaking about work. The mother may be clearing plates while half listening. A younger sibling may be watching television too loudly in the next room. On the screen, the families are cheerful, the problems are mild, and everything is usually solved in half an hour. But outside that glowing box, the world is not solving itself so easily. In the South, black students are being insulted, beaten, arrested, and sometimes killed for demanding rights the Constitution already claimed to guarantee. In Washington, officials speak of freedom while supporting policies that do not always look like freedom to the people living under them. In schools, children are told to hide under desks in case a nuclear bomb falls from the sky, as though a wooden desk could protect them from the end of the world. In newspapers, photographs from distant places begin to bring home the fact that America's power is not always clean, not always gentle, and not always honest. That teenager may not understand all of this yet, but the feeling begins somewhere. It begins as a question. Why do adults say one thing and do another? Why is peace defended with weapons that could destroy cities? Why is freedom praised in speeches while people are denied it at lunch counters? Why does everyone talk about individuality while demanding that everyone look, dress, marry, work, worship and behave in the same narrow ways? Why does the future feel so planned, so polished, and so empty? Those questions did not appear all at once. The counterculture was not born in a single year or a single place. It did not begin when someone first put on a fringe jacket or grew their hair past their collar. It developed slowly, unevenly, in layers. Some of its roots were in the civil rights movement, where young people watched disciplined courage confront official cruelty. Some were in the beat writers of the 1950s, who had already rejected middle-class respectability and searched for different forms of freedom in jazz clubs, cheap apartments, road trips, poetry readings, and spiritual experiments. Some were in the Cold War, with its constant fear of nuclear destruction. Some were in the universities, where more young Americans were studying than ever before and discovering that knowledge could make obedience harder. Some were in the living room, where television brought national contradictions into private homes. And some were simply in the fact that there were so many young people at once. That last point matters more than we sometimes remember. The post-war baby boom produced a huge generation of children who reached adolescence and young adulthood in the 1960s. They were not a tiny group of eccentrics hiding at the edge of society. They were numerous enough to become a social force. They filled high schools, colleges, streets, record stores, movie theatres, army draft boards, and protest marches. They bought music in enormous quantities. They changed fashion because there were enough of them to make entire industries pay attention. They challenged university administrations because there were enough students packed onto campuses to make those campuses feel like small cities. They frightened politicians because they could not be dismissed as a handful of troublemakers, even though many politicians tried very hard to do exactly that. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than the simple idea of young people rebelling against old people. Because not every young person joined the counterculture. Many did not. Many served in Vietnam. Many supported the war. Many cut their hair, went to church, married young, worked hard, and thought the protesters were spoiled or ungrateful. Many working-class young Americans looked at college radicals with anger and suspicion. Many black activists had little patience for white middle-class youths who treated rebellion as self-discovery, while others had been fighting for survival for generations. Many women inside the counterculture found that men who spoke beautifully about liberation still expected women to cook, clean, type, organise and sleep with them on male terms. Many people who entered the movement looking for freedom found exploitation, addiction, confusion, or loneliness. So we should not romanticise it too easily, but we should not dismiss it too easily either. The counterculture mattered because it exposed a real conflict inside American life. It asked whether prosperity was enough. It asked whether obedience was the same as morality. It asked whether a country could call itself free while demanding silence from so many of its own people. It asked whether the body, the family, the classroom, the workplace, the church, the military, and the government all had to operate according to inherited rules. It asked whether love could be political. It asked whether music could become a kind of public argument. It asked whether a person could step outside the expected path and still be fully human. Now, I want to ask you something before we move further into this story. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you hearing this in a quiet room, in a city, in a small town, in a house where other people are asleep, or somewhere with traffic outside the window? And when you think of the 1960s, what is the first image that appears in your mind? Is it a protest march? A soldier in Vietnam? A young woman with long hair walking through San Francisco? A record spinning on a turntable? A police line outside a convention hall? A college student holding a sign? A family watching the news in silence? The image that comes first often tells us what version of the decade we inherited. For some people, the 1960s still mean hope. For others, they mean disorder. For some, they mean liberation. For others, disrespect. For some, they mean moral courage. For others, moral collapse. And the strange thing is that all of those reactions have some historical basis. That is why this decade still feels alive in American memory. People are not only arguing about what happened, they are arguing about what it meant. Was the counterculture a necessary rebellion against hypocrisy, racism, militarism, and deadening conformity? Was it a selfish revolt by young people who had benefited from prosperity and then rejected the discipline that created it? Was it brave? Was it naive? Was it both? The answer depends on where you stand, what you value, and which part of the story you're looking at. Tonight, we're going to move through it slowly. Not as a cartoon of hippies and angry parents, not as a lecture about dates and slogans. We're going to treat it as a lived experience. We're going to walk into the America that existed before the rebellion seemed inevitable. The America of tidy subdivisions, office jobs, church socials, school dances, bomb shelters, television dinners, segregated neighbourhoods, and fathers who came home tired from work and expected not to be questioned too sharply at the table. We're going to see why that world felt safe to some and suffocating to others. We're going to follow the war as it moved from policy documents into draft notices, evening news broadcasts, and family arguments. We're going to listen to the music, not just as entertainment, but as a shared language for people who felt that ordinary speech had failed them. We are going to step onto campuses where students began by asking for a voice in university decisions and ended by challenging the structure of American power itself. We are going to enter communes where young people tried, sometimes sincerely and sometimes foolishly, to build new forms of family, work, sex, and belonging. We are going to look at the freedom they found and the damage they sometimes caused. And we're going to end, eventually, in the difficult years when the dream faded, when the music changed, when the war dragged on, when leaders were assassinated, when drugs took lives, when political hope turned into exhaustion, and when America discovered that even failed rebellions can permanently change a country. Before we go further, if this kind of historical storytelling speaks to you, if you like slow history, told through ordinary rooms, ordinary fears, ordinary decisions, and the private lives behind public events, it would mean a great deal if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. You do not have to do it this second. let the story earn it. If something tonight makes you think of your parents, your grandparents, your own youth, or the way every generation eventually has to decide what to keep and what to refuse, then that is a good moment. And if you feel like it, write in the comments where you are watching from and what the 1960s mean in your country or your family. Some people hear this story as American history, others hear it as youth history, others hear it as a warning. I read those comments, and they are often more interesting than anything I could have planned. Now let's begin with the country before the explosion, because to understand why a generation rebelled against America, we first have to understand the America they were rebelling against. And it was not, at least on the surface, a failing country. That is what makes the rebellion so interesting. The young did not rise up in a nation visibly ruined by defeat or poverty. They rose up in a nation that appeared to much of the world powerful, wealthy, confident and modern. The United States in the late 1950s and early 1960s had highways stretching across the continent, factories producing at a scale that astonished foreign observers, universities expanding, suburbs growing, and a middle class larger than anything the country had known before. American leaders spoke as if history itself had chosen their side. The Soviet Union was the enemy, communism was the threat, and the United States presented itself as the defender of liberty, prosperity, faith, and democratic order. For many families, this confidence was not fake. It was visible in the objects around them. A washing machine really did change the labour of a household. A refrigerator really did make daily life easier. A car really did expand the map of ordinary possibility. A college education really did open doors that had been closed to many previous generations. For white middle-class families especially, the post-war years could feel like proof that sacrifice had led somewhere. The father had served, worked, saved, and borrowed. The mother had built a home, stretched paychecks, raised children, and helped maintain the social world that made the family respectable. The children had bedrooms, school books, bicycles, and futures. It would be too easy and too unfair to look back at that world and see only repression. There was love in those houses. There was pride. There was effort. There was gratitude. There were parents who had known hunger and war and wanted nothing more radical than for their children never to know them. But comfort can hide problems for a long time. A polished table can still have tension around it. A new subdivision can still be built on exclusion. A country can celebrate freedom while teaching children where not to sit, whom not to marry, what not to say, and which questions are dangerous. The 1950s and early 1960s were filled with rules, many of them unwritten but strongly enforced. Men were expected to be providers, controlled, patriotic, heterosexual, and emotionally restrained. Women were expected to find fulfillment in marriage, motherhood, domestic skill, and support for male ambition. Black Americans were expected by much of white society to accept inequality quietly or ask for change slowly enough that no one in power felt too uncomfortable. Gay Americans were expected to remain hidden. Young people were expected to respect authority, dress properly, work hard, and understand that adulthood meant fitting into the institutions already waiting for them. The counterculture did not invent dissatisfaction with those rules. It gave dissatisfaction a public form. It turned private unease into clothing, music, protest, experiments, and communities. It made refusal visible. That visibility is part of why it alarmed so many people. A private doubt can be ignored. A son with long hair at the dinner table cannot. A daughter refusing the life her mother accepted cannot. A student march blocking a campus entrance cannot. A draft card burned in public cannot. A song played on the radio, heard by millions of teenagers at the same time cannot. The counterculture took feelings that might once have remained quiet and gave them sound, colour, language and bodies in the street. And one of the first things those bodies rejected was the idea that American life was already complete. They looked at the adults around them and saw people who had gained security, but sometimes seemed to have traded away honesty, pleasure, imagination, and moral courage to get it. That judgment was not always fair. Young people are not famous for their patience with the compromises of age, but it was powerful because it contained enough truth to spread. A suburban lawn could look beautiful and still feel like a boundary. A good job could pay well and still feel like a cage. A church could speak of love and still defend prejudice. A university could teach freedom of thought and still treat students like children. A government could speak of peace and still send young men to war. Once those contradictions became visible, they were hard to unsee. The strange thing about rebellion is that it often begins not with hatred, but with disappointment. Hatred may come later, after police batons, assassinations, draft notices, betrayals, and funerals. But disappointment comes first. You believe the story you were told, and then you discover that the story has missing pages. For many young Americans in the early 1960s, the missing pages were everywhere. They were in segregated schools and lunch counters. They were in the gap between democratic language and Cold War secrecy. They were in the pressure placed on women to smile through lives they had not chosen freely. They were in the fear that nuclear war could erase the future before anyone had a chance to live it. They were in the dull ache of being told to be grateful for a life that somehow did not feel alive enough. So before the music grows louder, before the campuses fill, before Haight-Ashbury becomes shorthand for a whole era, before Woodstock, before the Chicago Convention, before the communes and the underground newspapers and the bitter arguments over Vietnam, we need to stand for a while inside that earlier America. We need to hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the television announcer's voice in the living room, the father's car pulling into the driveway, the mother setting plates on the table, the teenager upstairs listening to a record a little too loudly, the younger children practicing duck and cover drills at school, the newspaper on the porch carrying stories about civil rights protests and Soviet missiles, and American advisors in a country called Vietnam that many families could not yet find easily on a map. Nothing has fully broken yet. Fully. Not in the way it will, but the pressure is already building inside the walls of ordinary life, and the first real question is why a nation that looks so successful could leave so many of its own children feeling that they had to escape it in order to tell the truth. If you had visited the United States at the beginning of the 1960s and only looked at the surface, you might have thought you were looking at a country that had solved the basic problem of modern life. That was the impression America wanted to give, and in many places it was the impression America gave very well. The roads were wider than they had ever been. The houses were newer. The appliances were shinier. The grocery stores were brighter. The cars had grown longer and lower, with chrome flashing in the sunlight like proof that the hard years were over. In magazines, advertisements showed smiling families gathered around breakfast tables, fathers in suits, mothers in clean dresses, children with combed hair and good teeth, everyone arranged inside a world that looked polished, orderly, and blessed. If history had a display window, post-war America placed itself behind the glass and turned on all the lights. This is where we have to begin, because the rebellion that came later does not make sense unless we first understand how comfortable the country looked to the people who defended it. It is easy, decades later, to speak as if the older generation was simply narrow, frightened, and controlling. Some were. But many were also people who had lived through conditions their children could barely imagine. They had seen banks fail, farms lost, bread lines stretching down city streets, men selling apples on corners, mothers watering down soup to make dinner last another night. Then they had seen war, rationing, telegrams, uniforms, casualty lists, and young men leaving home with no guarantee they would ever return. So when peace came, and the factories kept running, and paychecks became steadier, and mortgages became possible, and a small house with a lawn appeared within reach, they did not see conformity. They saw rescue. For millions of Americans, especially white middle-class Americans, the years after World War II created a level of everyday security that had once seemed almost impossible. The GI Bill helped veterans attend college, buy houses, and enter professions that had been out of reach for their parents. Government-backed mortgages encouraged suburban construction on a scale the country had never seen before. Places like Levittown became symbols of a new domestic promise, rows and rows of modest houses built quickly, efficiently, and almost identically, each one holding out the idea that an ordinary family could own a piece of the American future. The interstate highway systems spread across the map. Shopping centres followed the suburbs. Television sets entered living rooms. A family did not have to be wealthy to feel that progress had come home and taken off its coat. Let us step into one of those homes for a moment, not because every American lived this way, because they absolutely did not, but because this was the model that the country held up as normal. The house might be small by later standards, but to the family moving in, it feels spacious. There is a kitchen with modern cabinets, a refrigerator humming in the corner, a stove that does not require chopping wood or tending coal, a washing machine that shortens one of the heaviest domestic burdens women had carried for generations. There is a living room with a television, maybe not colour yet, but powerful all the same, a glowing square that brings presidents, comedians, news anchors, westerns, advertisements, and nuclear warnings into the same private space. There are bedrooms for children who may have grown up hearing their parents speak of shared rooms, cold flats, rented houses, and relatives taken in during hard times. Outside there is a lawn, and the lawn matters. It is not just grass, it is a statement. It says the family has arrived somewhere stable enough to maintain appearances. But the thing about appearances is that they require maintenance. That lawn had to be cut. That house had to be cleaned. Those children had to behave in a way that reflected well on the family. The father had to keep his job, keep his temper, keep up with payments, keep moving upward if he could. The mother had to keep the home cheerful, the meals regular, the children respectable, the husband supported, the neighbours reassured, and her own dissatisfaction, if she had any, carefully folded away where it would not embarrass anyone. In this world, comfort was real, but it was not free. It came with a script, and everyone in the house was expected to learn their lines. A young person growing up inside that world absorbed those expectations early. Boys were told, sometimes directly and sometimes just by watching, that manhood meant discipline, work, patriotism, heterosexual confidence, and emotional control. A boy who cried too easily, dressed too strangely, read too much poetry, questioned the military too openly, or failed to show interest in the approved forms of masculinity could feel the walls narrow around him quickly. Girls were taught that education was valuable, but usually not more valuable than marriage. A girl could be bright, ambitious, funny, restless, and talented, but the culture around her often took all of that and quietly pointed it toward being chosen by the right man. The magazines told her how to keep a husband. The schools told her how to be pleasant. The advertisements told her that appliances would make her happy. The churches told her family was her highest calling. The neighbours watched to see if she agreed. For some people, this arrangement did provide a sense of purpose. We should not pretend that every housewife was miserable, or that every office worker felt imprisoned. History becomes dishonest when it replaces one cliché with another. Many women loved their families deeply and took pride in making homes that were safe, generous, and well run. Many men found dignity in steady work and believed responsibility was not a burden, but a moral duty. Many children grew up in those houses feeling protected. The point is not that post-war domestic life was false from top to bottom. The point is that it was presented as universal, natural and sufficient, when in reality it left very little room for anyone who wanted or needed something else. And there were many people who needed something else. Start with the most obvious contradiction, the one America tried hardest to hide from itself while displaying its freedom to the world. The comfortable America of the post-war years was not equally comfortable for everyone. Black Americans had served in the war, worked in the factories, paid taxes, raised families, and carried the language of American democracy in their own mouths. But across much of the country they were denied the full rights that white Americans treated as ordinary. In the South, segregation-shaped schools, buses, restaurants, parks, hospitals, water fountains, voting booths, and courtrooms. In the North and West, discrimination often came through housing, hiring, policing, and school boundaries that could look less formal, but still worked with brutal efficiency. The suburban dream that became the national symbol of post-war success was often built with government support that excluded or disadvantaged black families. So when television showed the happy American home, it was also showing a door that had been closed to millions. This mattered profoundly to the young people who would later rebel, even those who were not themselves black, because the civil rights movement exposed the moral gap between American language and American reality. A teenager in a northern suburb could watch news footage of children walking past mobs to integrate a school. A college student could read about sit-ins where young black men and women sat at lunch counters with disciplined calm, while strangers poured food on them, screamed in their faces or dragged them away. The contrast was difficult to avoid. In classrooms, students were taught that America stood for liberty. On the evening news, they saw Americans beaten for asking to be served a cup of coffee. That kind of contradiction does something to the mind. It makes obedience harder to respect. There was another pressure running through this comfortable country, quieter but always present, and it came from the Cold War. The United States in the 1950s and early 1960s was rich, confident, and terrified. That combination is important. A family could own a new refrigerator and still wonder if nuclear war would end civilization before the children grew up. Schools held duck-and-cover drills in which children crouched under desks, covered their heads, and practiced surviving an attack no desk could actually protect them from. Some families built fallout shelters, or discussed where they might go if sirens sounded. Magazines printed diagrams explaining how to prepare for radioactive danger. Politicians spoke of strength, deterrence, vigilance, and the communist threat. The future was advertised in bright colours, but somewhere behind the advertisement was the mushroom cloud. Try to imagine what that does to a child. The adults tell you that America is good, safe, prosperous, and chosen for greatness. Then those same adults tell you to practice hiding under your desk, because at any moment the world might be destroyed in a war between governments you do not control. They tell you to plan for college, marriage, career, and family. But they also speak casually about megatons, missiles, fallout, and survival. They tell you to trust authority, then reveal by their own fear that authority may not be able to protect anything. Is it really surprising that some young people began to doubt the wisdom of the men in suits who managed the world? The fear was not imaginary. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the United States and the Soviet Union terrifyingly close to nuclear war. For 13 days, families listened to news reports and wondered whether ordinary life would simply continue or vanish. Many young people who lived through that moment later remembered it not as an abstract geopolitical event, but as a personal encounter with the fragility of everything adults had promised. The lawn, the school, the car, the family dinner, the college plan, the wedding someday, the baby someday, all of it could be erased by decisions made in rooms they would never enter. A generation did not have to be naturally rebellious to become skeptical under those conditions. Skepticism was almost rational. The workplace added its own form of pressure. For many men in the expanding middle class, the reward for post-war success was the office, and the office could be its own kind of uniform. The grey flannel suit became more than clothing. It became shorthand for a life of corporate loyalty, commuting, hierarchy, politeness, and quiet surrender to institutional expectations. Men took trains into cities, sat under fluorescent lights, attended meetings, filed reports, followed orders, and tried to rise without appearing too disruptive. The language of business promised opportunity, but it often demanded obedience. To a son watching his father come home tired each evening, loosening his tie with a drink in his hand, the lesson could be confusing. This was success. This was what all the schooling and discipline and respectability were supposed to produce. And yet the man who had achieved it did not always look free. The same question appeared in different forms across the culture. If America was so successful, why did so many people need tranquilizers to get through the day? Why did so many marriages look stable from outside and lonely from within? Why did so many neighborhoods seem friendly but punish anyone who was different? Why did the country speak endlessly about individual freedom while making ordinary people afraid to be unusual? Why did children have to pledge allegiance each morning in school if loyalty was so natural and unquestioned? Why did churches speak about the soul, while so many adults seemed spiritually exhausted? These questions were not always spoken aloud at first. They accumulated in private. They gathered in bedrooms, dormitories, coffee houses, parked cars, and late-night conversations between friends who had begun to suspect that the official story did not explain their lives. Books helped give that suspicion language. Before the counterculture became a mass youth movement, writers had already begun describing the emptiness they saw beneath post-war prosperity. Critics of conformity wrote about the organisation man, the lonely crowd, the hidden pressures of suburban life, the way mass society could smooth people down until they no longer recognised their own desires. The beat writers had already pushed against this world in the 1950s. Jack Kerouac's Road, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, the jazz clubs, the cheap rooms, the restless search for intensity and spiritual experience, all of it offered an earlier refusal of the neat life. Most Americans did not become beats, of course. Many thought them immoral, dirty, pretentious, or ridiculous. But their importance was not in numbers alone. They proved that refusal could be made into a style, a voice, a way of moving through the country without asking permission from the people who owned the suburbs. Music did something similar, though more widely and with less need for explanation. Rock and roll had already frightened adults in the 1950s because it gave teenagers a sound of their own, physical, loud, rhythmic, and difficult to supervise. Elvis Presley's hips were treated as a national problem by people who sensed correctly that music could loosen discipline faster than a political essay. By the early 1960s, folk music, rhythm and blues, soul and rock were creating emotional spaces where young people could hear longing, anger, humour, desire and protest in forms that did not sound like school assemblies or political speeches. A song could say what a son could not say at dinner. A record could make a girl feel less alone in a bedroom where the future seemed already arranged. Music did not create the rebellion by itself, but it made rebellion feel shared. Television, oddly enough, both supported the comfortable order and helped weaken it. Families gathered around the set and watched programs that reinforced the image of normal American life. But the same technology brought images into the living room that could not be easily controlled. Civil rights demonstrations, police violence, political debates, international crises, and eventually Vietnam appeared in the same domestic space as sitcoms and advertisements. This created a strange effect. The living room became both a shelter from the world and a window into its failures. Parents might have preferred to separate public disorder from private life, but the screen did not fully allow that. A child could sit on the carpet in a safe suburban house and watch the country's conflicts flicker in black and white a few feet away. The comfort of this America also depended on silence around sexuality. Public morality remained strict in ways that can be difficult to imagine now. Sex was everywhere in implication, and almost nowhere in honest conversation. Young people were expected to control themselves, marry properly, and keep desire within approved boundaries. Women carried much of the burden of sexual respectability. A young man might be excused for desire, even praised for it quietly, while a young woman could have her reputation permanently damaged. Gay and lesbian Americans lived under threat of exposure, arrest, job loss, medical abuse, family rejection, and public humiliation. The culture insisted that normality was obvious, but it had to police normality constantly, which suggests that it was not as secure as it claimed. By the early 1960s, the first cracks in this sexual order were widening. The birth control pill, approved for contraceptive use in 1960, did not instantly create the sexual revolution. but it changed the practical realities of sex in a way that would become enormous. It separated sexual activity from the same level of pregnancy risk that had shaped women's lives for centuries. At first, access was limited, and social judgment remained powerful. But the existence of the pill altered the imagination. It made it easier for young women and men to ask whether old rules were moral truths or social controls. That question would soon move far beyond private relationships and into the politics of gender, marriage, medicine, religion, and personal freedom. At the same time, universities were changing. More young Americans were going to college, and campuses were becoming places where large numbers of people in their late teens and early 20s lived together, read widely, argued constantly, and stood at a slight distance from direct parental supervision. This setting mattered. A young person living at home might feel uneasy alone. A young person on a campus could discover that hundreds or thousands of others felt the same unease. The cafeteria, the dorm room, the student newspaper office, the lecture hall, the coffee shop near campus, these became laboratories of dissatisfaction. Ideas moved quickly. So did rumours, songs, manifestos and styles. A student could arrive in September with conventional beliefs and leave in June questioning war, race, gender, capitalism, religion, and the authority of the university itself. Still, we should remember that much of the rebellion began not with a desire to destroy America, but with a desire to make America live up to what it had taught its children to believe. That is one of the great ironies of the period. Many young activists had absorbed the language of democracy very seriously. They had been taught that citizens had rights, that governments required consent, that moral courage mattered, that freedom was worth defending. Then they looked around and applied those lessons more aggressively than their teachers expected. When they challenged segregation, they were not importing foreign values. They were using American promises against American practices. When they questioned the draft, they were asking whether citizenship required unquestioning obedience to wars they believed unjust. When they demanded a voice in university decisions, they were extending democratic logic into institutions that had often treated students like managed children. This is why the comfortable America felt so unstable to the people inside it. It contained ideals that could be turned against its own arrangements. Parents told children to be honest, and some children became honest about racism. Schools praised critical thinking, and some students began thinking critically about the schools. Churches taught conscience, and some young believers used conscience to oppose their church's silence. Politicians spoke of freedom, and a generation asked whether freedom included the right to reject the very life those politicians admired. The rebellion was not simply a rejection of American ideals. In many cases, it was an argument over who had the right to define them. There was also boredom, and boredom should not be underestimated in history. People often prefer grand explanations, and there were certainly grand forces at work, but part of the counterculture's energy came from the ordinary boredom of young people, surrounded by comfort that felt repetitive and emotionally thin. The routines of suburban life could seem endless. School, homework, television, church, chores, dances, sports, polite conversations, approved ambitions, whispered gossip, and the steady pressure to become a slightly updated version of one's parents. For a restless teenager, the very predictability that comforted adults could become unbearable. The road promised movement, the city promised anonymity, the campus promised ideas, the protest promised purpose, the concert promised release, the commune promised escape, the drug experience for some promised a door in the wall. Not all of these promises were kept. Some were dangerous from the beginning, but the hunger behind them was real. That hunger often appeared first as style, because style is one of the earliest languages young people can control. Before a person has money, political power, or institutional authority, they can change their hair, they can change their clothes, they can change the music they play, they can change the way they speak. Adults sometimes dismiss these things as superficial. but they understood their power well enough to become furious about them. Long hair on men became a public argument because it challenged assumptions about masculinity, discipline, cleanliness, patriotism, and respect. A young man with hair past his collar was not merely choosing a different look. To many adults, he was refusing a whole chain of meanings. A young woman dressing in ways that rejected polished femininity was not merely being casual. She was stepping away from a system that had taught her to be decorative, controlled, and pleasing. The surface carried the deeper conflict. Inside families, these conflicts could be painful because they were intimate. It is one thing to disagree with a politician. It is another to look across the dinner table and realize your own child sees your life as a warning. Many parents experienced the counterculture not as a political debate, but as a personal rejection. They had worked, sacrificed, saved, and worried so their children could have better lives. Then the children said the better life was empty. That hurt. It still hurts when families tell these stories. A father who'd gone to war at 19 did not easily understand a son who burned a draft card. A mother who had endured domestic expectations because she believed they were necessary did not easily understand a daughter who called those expectations oppressive. A family that had finally entered the middle class did not easily understand a child who wanted to leave home, live with strangers, and own almost nothing. The rebellion was national, but it often arrived as a slammed bedroom door. And yet, even inside the comfortable home, some parents knew more than they admitted. Some fathers hated their jobs. Some mothers felt trapped. Some marriages survived because divorce was shameful, not because love was alive. Some adults envied the young people who dared to say no, even as they condemned them. This is one of the quieter truths of the era. The counterculture frightened adults partly because it attacked their values, but also because it exposed their compromises. It suggested that lives built on duty and respectability might contain buried grief. It suggested that obedience might not be the same as virtue. It suggested that the American dream, once achieved, might still leave a person awake at night wondering why achievement did not feel like happiness. By the time the 1960s began to gather speed, the comfortable America was still standing. The lawns were still cut, the offices were still full. The churches still held services, the schools still opened each morning, the television still glowed in the living room. But beneath these routines, pressure was moving through the country. Civil rights activists were forcing the nation to confront its racial order. Young women were beginning to question the narrow futures offered to them. Students were discovering the power of collective action. Artists and musicians were giving language to restlessness. The Cold War made the future feel fragile. The suburbs made success feel strangely enclosed. The university made doubt contagious. The family made rebellion personal. So when we ask why a generation rebelled against America, we should not imagine that they woke one morning and casually chose disorder because life had been too easy. It is more accurate to say that many of them grew up inside a world that promised comfort, then discovered that comfort could feel like a bargain made without their consent. It asked them to accept prosperity in exchange for silence, safety in exchange for conformity, belonging in exchange for obedience, and adulthood in exchange for surrendering certain questions before they were even fully formed. Some accepted that bargain, some never saw it as a bargain at all, but others began to refuse. The refusal did not yet have one shape. It might be a student joining a civil rights sit-in. It might be a young man reading banned or disapproved books in a dormitory. It might be a girl wondering why every adult woman she knows seems tired in a way no advertisement admits. It might be a teenager hearing Bob Dylan for the first time and realizing that a song could sound like an accusation. It might be a boy watching his father shave before work and feeling with guilt that he did not want to become him. It might be a young couple deciding they did not want a house, a mortgage, and a life measured by appliances. It might be nothing more dramatic than a question spoken softly to a friend late at night. Does this feel wrong to you too? That is how a culture begins to shift, not only through manifestos and marches, but through private recognition. One person discovers that another person feels the same unease. Then a small group discovers the same thing, then a campus, then a neighborhood, then a city. The comfortable America did not collapse. It was too large, too wealthy, too institutionally powerful for that. But its authority weakened in the minds of millions of young people, and once authority weakens internally, once people stop believing that the old rules are natural, everything that follows becomes possible. The clothes, the music, the protests, the communes, the confrontations with police, the arguments over war, the new sexual ethics, the experiments with drugs, the search for spiritual alternatives, all of it begins somewhere in that earlier moment when the official version of happiness stopped convincing the children it was meant to reassure. And the children themselves are where we have to look next, because they were not simply rebels appearing from nowhere. They were the sons and daughters of victory, prosperity, fear, television, suburbia, civil defense drills, college expansion, racial crisis, and nuclear uncertainty. They had been given more than many generations before them, and that fact would be used against them again and again. Spoiled, ungrateful, soft, childish, irresponsible. These words followed them through the decade. Sometimes there was truth in the criticism. Sometimes there was cruelty in it. Usually there was both. But the deeper question is what happens when a generation is raised to expect the future and then begins to suspect the future may be poisoned, dishonest, or already arranged by people who will not have to live with the consequences as long. That is where the next part of this story begins, not in the public image of rebellion, but in the private formation of the young Americans who would carry it. They were born into congratulations. That is one of the simplest ways to understand the young Americans who came of age in the 1960s. Before they were old enough to speak, before they had opinions about war or music or race or authority, they were already part of a national mood of relief. Their birth came after years of depression and war, after ration books and separation, after military funerals and factories running through the night, after a long period when many families had postponed ordinary hopes because the world had seemed too unstable to hold them. Then the war ended. Soldiers came home, weddings happened, houses filled, maternity wards grew crowded. The country looked at its newborn children and saw evidence that life was beginning again. Between 1946 and 1964, roughly 76 million babies were born in the United States. That number is so large that it can become meaningless unless we bring it down to the scale of ordinary life. It meant classrooms that needed more desks. It meant neighborhoods full of bicycles left on lawns. It meant schools built quickly on the edges of suburbs because the old ones could not hold everyone. It meant toy companies, cereal companies, clothing companies, television producers, record labels, textbook publishers, and college administrators all realizing at different speeds that the young were not just a stage of life. They were becoming a market, a public, and eventually a force. The baby boomers did not invent youth, of course, but they made youth impossible to ignore. At first, though, they were simply children. They were pushed in strollers through new subdivisions, buckled into cars for Sunday drives, dressed for church, lined up for school photographs, vaccinated in public health campaigns, and taught to believe that they belonged to a country moving upward. Their parents had known scarcity. Many of the children knew abundance as the normal background of life. There might be a freezer in the kitchen, a television in the living room, a baseball glove in the garage, a record player somewhere in the house, and enough food that a child could complain about dinner without being told, with absolute seriousness, that hunger was waiting nearby. This difference between parental memory and childhood experience created a gap that would widen over time. The parents remembered what had been survived. The children noticed what was being demanded. That does not mean these children were spoiled in the simple way their critics later claimed. Some were, certainly. Every generation produces its share of young people who mistake discomfort for injustice. But the story is more complicated than that. The children of post-war prosperity grew up in a world that gave them more material security than many earlier generations, while also placing them under a kind of psychological pressure that was new in scale and strange in character. They were told the future was theirs, but they were also taught that the future might end without warning. They were told they lived in the freest country on earth, but they watched people punished for demanding freedom. They were told adults had made the world safe, then spent their childhoods practicing for nuclear attack. They inherited bedrooms, bicycles, school books, and college dreams. They also inherited fear. For many of them, fear entered school before they had words to understand it. Think of a classroom in the 1950s or early 1960s. The walls have maps, alphabet charts, perhaps a portrait of the president, perhaps a flag near the blackboard. The children sit at wooden desks with metal legs, pencils in hand, shoes tapping softly against the floor. The teacher is calm because teachers were expected to be calm. Then comes the drill. The children are told to duck and cover. They crawl beneath their desks, tuck their heads, cover the backs of their necks and wait. The instruction is practical on the surface, almost ordinary like a fire drill. But the threat being rehearsed is not ordinary. It is not a fire in the hallway or a storm outside. It is the possibility of a nuclear bomb. To a small child, the meaning of this may not be clear at first. Children accept many strange things because adults present them as normal. If the teacher says climb under the desk, you climb under the desk. If the film strip turtle tells you to protect yourself from a flash, you learn the motion. If sirens are tested, you listen. But over time, the question grows. What exactly are we hiding from? Why does the desk matter? Why do adults speak of mushroom clouds and fallout and shelters? Why does the school treat the end of the world like something that can be managed by lining up quietly and following instructions? The ritual itself carried a message deeper than the official explanation. It told children that the adults were afraid and that their fear had been turned into routine. This is something modern people sometimes miss when they look back at Cold War childhood. The fear was not constant in the sense that every child trembled every hour. Children still played, laughed, fought, watched cartoons, collected cards, went to dances and worried about ordinary things. But nuclear fear lived in the background like a low electrical hum. It was present in news reports, school programs, political speeches, comic books, public service films, family conversations, and the architecture of fallout shelters. It was present whenever the Soviets were mentioned, whenever missiles were discussed, whenever a crisis appeared on television. It taught children that history was not safely behind them. History could arrive suddenly, in the sky, with a light brighter than the sun. This mattered because the older generation had been formed by past catastrophe, while the younger generation was formed by possible future catastrophe. Their parents looked backward and said, "We survived." The children looked forward and wondered whether anyone would. That difference shaped the emotional climate of the 1960s. A father who had fought in World War II might believe danger demanded discipline, loyalty, and national strength. His teenage son might look at nuclear weapons and decide that discipline and loyalty had produced a world capable of suicide. Both were responding to fear. They simply drew different conclusions from it. Then came Sputnik. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite into orbit, many American adults experienced it as a national humiliation and a military warning. For children, the meaning could be simpler and more unsettling. There was now something made by the enemy moving above their heads. Adults spoke urgently about science, math, rockets, and competition. Schools emphasized technical education. The future became more serious. The sky itself seemed politicized. A child who had once looked upward and seen stars now heard adults speaking of satellites, missiles, and the possibility that space might become another battlefield. The wonder of the modern age was inseparable from dread. At the same time, television was changing the way children understood the world. Earlier generations of Americans had received much of their picture of public life through newspapers, radio, newsreels, sermons, gossip, and family stories. The baby boom generation grew up with moving images entering the home. Television created a shared national childhood. Children in different states watched some of the same programs, laughed at the same comedians, saw the same commercials, and learned the same jingles. It helped produce a common culture, but it also made contradiction more visible. A child could watch an advertisement for a sparkling kitchen, then a news segment showing police violence in the South. A family could laugh at a sitcom, then fall silent during coverage of a crisis. The screen did not explain everything, but it placed things beside each other that adults might have preferred to keep separate. The Kennedy years intensified this feeling of televised history. John F. Kennedy was not the first president to use image, youth, and performance, but he arrived at a moment when television made those qualities unusually powerful. To many young Americans, Kennedy seemed different from older politicians. He was polished, witty, handsome, modern, and linked to ideas of service and possibility. His administration spoke the language of a new generation, even when its policies were more cautious than its image. The Peace Corps, the space program, civil rights speeches, and the idea of a new frontier all suggested that youth and public purpose might belong together. For children and teenagers, politics could seem, briefly, not only like duty, but like invitation. Then, in November 1963, that image was shattered in Dallas. The assassination of Kennedy was one of the defining emotional events for Americans growing up in the period. Again, we have to think about it not only as a political event, but as a domestic one. It came through school announcements, stunned teachers, television broadcasts, crying parents, newspapers, and the strange atmosphere of adults who suddenly did not know what to say. Children saw the nation grieving in real time. They watched the funeral. They saw the riderless horse, the widow, the small son saluting. Public tragedy entered private rooms and stayed there. For many young people, Kennedy's death became an early lesson that confidence could be murdered in daylight. It is not that every future protester became radical because of the assassination. History rarely works so neatly. But the event damaged the emotional architecture of the early 1960s. It suggested that even the most protected figures were vulnerable, that the country was not as stable as it appeared, that violence was not something that happened only elsewhere. In the years that followed, more assassinations would deepen that wound. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy. By the end of the decade, many young Americans would feel that the figures who spoke most urgently of change were being removed one by one. But Kennedy's death came early enough to mark the threshold. Something bright had been promised, and then the television showed the motorcade, the hospital, the swearing in on the plane, and the funeral. Childhood absorbed the message. Race was another teacher. White children in comfortable homes were often protected from the full reality of segregation, but they could not be protected completely. The civil rights movement forced scenes of American cruelty into national view. Black children, of course, did not need television to teach them that freedom was conditional. They knew it from schools, buses, neighborhoods, police, employers, and daily humiliations. For them, the inheritance of fear was older and more direct. A black child in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, or Louisiana did not need to be told that America contained danger. The danger had names, faces, laws, sheriffs, mobs, and customs. But television allowed many white children to see parts of that danger for the first time in a form adults could not easily dismiss. Imagine being a young person told every morning in school to pledge allegiance to a republic with liberty and justice for all, then seeing children your own age surrounded by hatred because they tried to enter a school. Imagine hearing adults praise law and order, then watching officers turn dogs and fire hoses on demonstrators. Imagine being taught that communism was evil because it denied human freedom, while seeing your own country deny basic rights to its own citizens. Some young people ignored the contradiction, some explained it away, some adopted the prejudices of their families and communities, but others could not. The civil rights movement became a moral education for a generation, and once that education began, it did not remain confined to race. It taught methods of protest, languages of justice, and suspicion toward official explanations. It showed that respectable authorities could be wrong. It showed that law could defend injustice. It showed that young people could confront institutions and sometimes change them. College students were especially affected. The early sit-in movement of 1960, beginning with black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, showed a form of disciplined, youth-led resistance that made a deep impression. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee emerged from this world, and its courage, seriousness, and willingness to face violence changed the meaning of student activism. Many white students who later joined anti-war protests first learned activism from the civil rights struggle, though not always with sufficient humility about the difference between chosen risk and inherited danger. Still, the influence was real. The counterculture's later language of liberation, authenticity, and moral witness owed a great debt to black freedom movements that had been fighting long before white college students discovered rebellion. Inside the schools and homes of the post-war generation, another kind of fear operated through expectations. The young were watched closely, not always harshly, but steadily. Their grades mattered because education was tied to mobility. Their manners mattered because family reputation mattered. Their sexuality mattered because shame remained a powerful social weapon. Their patriotism mattered because the Cold War made dissent suspicious. Their appearance mattered because conformity was treated as evidence of character. A boy's haircut could become an argument about whether he respected his father. A girl's skirt length could become an argument about whether she respected herself. Music could become a battlefield. Language could become a battlefield. Friends could become a battlefield. The home itself, the place advertised as safe and loving, often became the first arena where the larger conflicts of the decade were rehearsed. The parents were not always wrong to worry. The world was changing quickly, and they could see dangers their children sometimes underestimated. Drugs would damage lives. Sexual freedom would not always produce tenderness or equality. Political movements would sometimes excuse cruelty in the name of ideals. Some young people would mistake rebellion for wisdom and leave wreckage behind them. But the parents' fears were mixed with another fear, one they did not always name. They were afraid their children might reject the meaning of the parents' own sacrifices. If the suburban house was called a cage, what did that say about the years spent earning it? If steady work was called deadening, what did that say about the father who had given his body and time to it? If marriage was called oppressive, what did that say about the mother who had built her identity around it? The youth rebellion hurt because it was not only political, it questioned the lives of the people who had raised the rebels. A child born into prosperity can still feel trapped by gratitude. That is a difficult thing to explain, but it was central to this generation's experience. Many young Americans knew that their parents had worked hard for them. They knew, at least vaguely, that earlier decades had been harder. They knew they were lucky compared with many people in the world. Adults reminded them of this constantly. You have everything, they were told. You have no idea how good you have it. That sentence may have been true materially, but it did not answer the questions forming inside them. Having everything, as defined by the older generation, did not mean having a life that felt honest. It did not mean having a future one had chosen. It did not mean trusting the government, accepting the war, ignoring racism, obeying sexual rules, or believing that a lawn and a job could satisfy every human need. The very size of the generation made these feelings more powerful. If one young person feels alienated, it may remain private sorrow. If millions feel some version of alienation at the same time, institutions begin to feel the pressure. High schools became crowded with restless teenagers. Colleges became crowded with students who had time, proximity, and enough education to question the world that produced them. Record stores and radio stations became meeting grounds for shared emotion. Fashion spread quickly because young people were watching one another. A style that might once have remained local could become national. The youth market gave young people cultural power. before they had formal political power. They could not always vote, especially before the voting age was lowered to 18 in the 1970s, but they could buy records, fill concerts, occupy campuses, and make themselves visible enough that the country had to react. There is a temptation to treat the baby boomers as uniquely self-important, and in some ways the criticism is understandable. The sheer number of them, combined with the attention paid to them by media and business, encouraged a belief that their feelings mattered historically. But in the 1960s, that belief was not entirely delusional. They were living through events that placed youth at the centre of national conflict. The draft targeted young men. Universities housed the debates. Music carried the mood. Civil rights activism depended heavily on young organisers. The sexual revolution involved young bodies making decisions older institutions wanted to control. The generation did not merely imagine itself into significance. It was pulled there by demography, policy, media, and crisis. Still, the experience was uneven. A young man from a wealthy family could often avoid consequences that fell heavily on others. College deferments meant that class shaped who went to Vietnam and who had time to protest it. A white student could experiment with rebellion in ways that a black activist could not safely imitate, without facing harsher punishment. A middle-class teenager could romanticize poverty while actual poor families tried desperately to escape it. A young woman might join a movement promising liberation and find herself making coffee for men who spoke of equality in public and practiced entitlement in private. These contradictions were present from the beginning. The children of prosperity were not all equally prosperous, and the fear they inherited did not fall evenly across race, class, gender, or region. For a working-class family, the comforts of post-war America could be more fragile. The father's job might depend on a factory, a union, a supervisor, or a local economy already beginning to shift. The son might not see college as a place of self-discovery, but as something distant or unaffordable. The military might offer income, training, honour, or simply the clearest available path. When middle-class protesters spoke of dropping out, working-class youths sometimes heard contempt for the very stability their families had struggled to build. This class tension would shape the politics of the late 1960s and beyond. The counterculture claimed to speak for youth, but not all youth recognised themselves in it. Even so, the broader feeling of inherited fear crossed many boundaries. Black children feared racist violence and blocked futures. White suburban children feared nuclear war and emotional suffocation. Working-class boys feared the draft and economic failure. Girls feared pregnancy, shame, limited choices, and the loss of self inside marriage. Gay and lesbian youths feared exposure and isolation. Students feared being absorbed into institutions they no longer trusted. Some fears were far more dangerous than others. Some were immediate, some atmospheric. But together they created a generation unusually aware that the adult world was unstable, even when it looked successful. This is why the language of authenticity became so important. Young people began to speak, sometimes awkwardly and sometimes with great seriousness, about being real, being honest, getting free, finding themselves, refusing hypocrisy. Later generations would mock some of this language, and not without reason. It could become vague, self-indulgent, and blind to practical consequences, but its rise tells us something important. When a society is full of scripts, authenticity becomes rebellion. If the office has a script, the school has a script, the church has a script, the family has a script, masculinity has a script, femininity has a script, patriotism has a script, and even happiness has a script, then the desire to speak without one can feel urgent. The young wanted lives that did not feel pre-written. Their childhood had prepared them for this in a strange way. They had been told constantly that they were special, that America was special, that the future was special. They had watched rockets rise, televisions glow, suburbs expand, and presidents speak of frontiers. They had been taught that progress was natural, so when they encountered injustice, secrecy, boredom, and fear, they did not always accept them as permanent. That is another difference between generations shaped by scarcity and generations shaped by promise. People who grow up expecting little may endure disappointment as normal. People raised inside promises often become furious when the promises fail. The anger of the 1960s was partly the anger of belief betrayed. There is a scene worth imagining because it happened in countless variations. A young person sits alone in a bedroom at night. The house is quiet. Downstairs, the parents believe the child is doing homework or sleeping. On the desk, there are school books, maybe a college brochure, maybe a draft registration notice for an older brother, maybe a newspaper with news from Birmingham, Moscow, Washington, or Saigon. A radio plays softly. The song is not approved exactly, but not forbidden enough to turn off. Something in the singer's voice makes the room feel larger. The young person does not yet have a plan. They may not know the word counterculture. They may not want to march, move to San Francisco, take drugs, join a commune, or challenge the government. They simply know that the future being described by adults no longer feels inevitable. This private moment matters because public rebellion depends on private permission. Before someone stands in a crowd, they usually cross an interior line. They allow themselves to think the forbidden thought. Maybe my parents are wrong. Maybe my country is wrong. Maybe the rules are not sacred. Maybe I do not have to become the person they expect. Maybe fear is being used to control me. Maybe comfort is not the same as truth. Once that line is crossed, even quietly, the world changes. The old authority may still have power, but it no longer has the same hold on the imagination. By the mid-1960s, more and more young Americans were crossing that line. Some did it through politics, some through music, some through religion or philosophy, some through sex, some through drugs, some through friendship with people their parents had warned them against, some through books discovered at exactly the right age, some through the shock of seeing a civil rights worker beaten or a village burning on television, some through the simple misery of looking at the respectable adults around them and thinking, I cannot live like that. Their reasons differed, and their courage differed, and their understanding differed. But the movement of mind was similar. The prosperous world had not protected them from fear. In some ways, it had taught fear while pretending to offer safety. The tragedy and energy of the generation came from that contradiction. They were privileged enough, many of them, to imagine alternatives. They were frightened enough to feel alternatives were necessary. They were educated enough to criticize institutions. They were young enough to believe institutions could be transformed quickly. They were numerous enough to find one another. They were televised enough to become symbols before they fully understood themselves. And they were living in a country powerful enough to inspire both loyalty and rage. So the children of prosperity grew into adolescents and young adults carrying a burden that was difficult to name. They had inherited their parents' victory, but not their parents' faith in the institutions that victory had strengthened. They had inherited material comfort, but not certainty. They had inherited the language of freedom, but not patience for its contradictions. They had inherited the bomb, the draft, the television, the suburb, the university, the civil rights crisis, the ideal of authenticity, and the suspicion that adulthood has offered to them might be a form of disappearance. This did not make rebellion inevitable in every life, but it made rebellion imaginable, and once it became imaginable to enough people at the same time, it began to move outward. The next force that would turn private unease into public rupture was war. Not war as their fathers had understood it, with Pearl Harbor, enlistment posters, clear enemies, and victory parades, but a different kind of war, distant at first, confusing in its explanations, televised in its violence, and increasingly tied to the bodies of young men who had no clear say in the policy that might send them across the ocean. Vietnam did not create every part of the counterculture, but it gathered the fears of the generation into one unavoidable question. What did America have the right to ask of its children, And what could those children refuse? At first, for many American families, Vietnam was not a place that felt real. It was a name in the newspaper, a country far away, a shape on a map that most people could not have drawn with any confidence. It did not arrive in the American imagination with the sudden clarity of Pearl Harbor or the huge public certainty of World War II. There was no single morning when the whole country woke up and understood itself to be entering a great national trial. Vietnam came gradually, through small announcements, official briefings, presidential statements, military advisors, newspaper columns, maps on television, and words that sounded technical enough to keep emotion at a distance: containment, communism, escalation, advisors, pacification, domino theory, limited war. Each phrase had a smooth surface. Each phrase made the war sound like something being managed by serious men who knew what they were doing. But wars do not remain inside language forever. Eventually they enter bodies. They enter houses. They enter kitchens, bedrooms, schools, churches, factories, college campuses, and mailboxes. Vietnam entered American life in the form of draft notices, telegrams, news footage, arguments at dinner tables, photographs of burning villages, casualty counts spoken by television anchors, and young men coming home changed or not coming home at all. It entered through the living room, which is part of what made it so different. Earlier wars had been reported to Americans, but Vietnam was shown to them with a frequency and intimacy that no previous war had carried. The screen that had sold the post-war dream now carried helicopters, wounded soldiers, jungle patrols, prisoners, protests, and officials insisting that progress was being made. Imagine a family living in 1966 or 1967. The room itself might look ordinary. A sofa, an ashtray, a lamp, a coffee table, perhaps a framed school photograph, perhaps a flag folded somewhere from a father's service in the last war. The television is on after supper. The same screen that has shown comedies and quiz shows now shows a war zone. A newsman's voice is steady, professional, carefully controlled. Behind him are images that do not feel controlled at all. Soldiers move through tall grass. Helicopters lift dust into the air. A village burns. A young American, not much older than the boy sitting on the carpet watching, is carried on a stretcher. No one in the room says very much at first. The father may clear his throat. The mother may look away. The teenage son may stare longer than anyone wants him to. The younger children may not understand, but they understand enough to know the adults have gone quiet. This is one of the central facts of Vietnam in American memory. It did not stay overseas. It became a nightly presence. People often call it the first television war, and while that phrase can be simplified too much, it captures something real. Television did not show everything. It did not show the full scale of Vietnamese suffering. It did not show every decision, every village, every prison, every act of fear, every act of bravery, every lie, every confusion. But it showed enough to make distance collapse. A war once described through official statements became visible in fragments, and those fragments worked on the public mind. They gave Americans images to place beside the government's words, and over time the images and the words began to separate. For the young, this separation mattered deeply. The same generation that had practiced duck-and-cover drills now watched another kind of official confidence unfold. Presidents and military leaders said the war was necessary. They said communism had to be stopped. They said the United States had commitments. They said South Vietnam must not fall. They said American credibility was at stake. They said victory was possible if the country remained firm. But on television, victory did not look close or clear. It looked like mud, jungle, body bags, exhausted faces and villages whose names Americans heard once and forgot. The war did not fit easily into the moral structure their parents associated with World War II. There was no Hitler. There was no attack on Hawaii. There was no obvious final objective that could be pictured like Berlin falling or battleships surrendering in a harbour. There was instead a slow, grinding conflict in a place many Americans had not thought about before and did not fully understand while it was happening. The older generation often saw Vietnam through the lens of the Cold War and World War II. To them, appeasement had been a terrible lesson. Totalitarian ideologies had to be resisted early, not after they had swallowed continents. If communism was advancing, then America had a duty to stand against it. For many parents, especially those who had served in the 1940s, opposition to the war could look like weakness, selfishness, or betrayal. They had done their duty when history demanded it. Why should their sons do less? The question was not abstract in those households. It came with uniforms in closets, medals in drawers, scars, photographs of dead friends and memories that had never fully healed. When a father said service was honourable, he often spoke from a place deeper than politics, but sons did not always inherit the same certainty. A young man facing the draft in 1968 was not being asked to fight the war his father had fought. He was being asked to fight this war with these explanations, under these leaders, for these shifting goals. That difference opened a crack in the idea of duty. The draft made the war intimate in a way no speech could avoid. A young man could disagree with foreign policy as a distant matter, but a draft notice changed disagreement into personal danger. It meant a government document could reach into his life and redirect his body across an ocean. It meant his future, his college plans, his relationships, his job, his sense of self, his very survival could be claimed by the state. For many young Americans, this was the moment when politics stopped being something adults discussed and became something that could take you away. The draft was not experienced equally. This is important, because the counterculture's relationship to Vietnam was shaped by class and race in ways that later memory sometimes smooths over. College deferments meant that students could often delay service, while young men without access to college had fewer protections. Wealthier families had more knowledge, more lawyers, more doctors, more ways to navigate the system. Working-class men, black men, Latino men, and rural men often carried a heavier burden. Some enlisted voluntarily out of patriotism, economic need, family tradition, or the belief that military service could offer structure and opportunity. Others went because they had no realistic way out. Some who protested were risking their futures. Others were protected enough to turn resistance into identity. The unfairness of the system became one more reason many Americans came to see the war not as shared sacrifice but as selective sacrifice. At draft boards across the country, the conflict became local. These were not marble buildings in Washington. They were offices in towns and cities, staffed by people who sorted young men into categories that could determine the course of their lives. A classification on paper could mean deferment, service, uncertainty, or panic. Families waited for numbers, letters, decisions. Young men calculated their options. Could they stay in school? Could they claim a medical exemption? Could they enter the National Guard? Could they become conscientious objectors? Could they leave the country? Could they refuse and face prison? These were not theoretical choices. They were conversations held in dorm rooms, kitchens, parked cars, union halls, churches, and lawyers' offices. The war forced young people to ask what kind of claim the nation had on them, and whether conscience could stand against law. This is where Vietnam and the counterculture began to overlap, though they were never exactly the same thing. Not everyone against the war was part of the counterculture. Many anti-war critics were clergy, veterans, professors, parents, politicians, civil rights leaders, or ordinary citizens with conventional lives. Not everyone in the counterculture was a serious political thinker. Some were more interested in music, drugs, sexual freedom, or personal escape than in policy. But the war gave the counterculture a central enemy and a moral urgency it might otherwise have lacked. It turned refusal into something more than style. Long hair, protest songs, draft card burnings, marches, sit-ins, and campus occupations became tied in the public mind to the question of Vietnam. To supporters, this looked like conscience. To opponents, it looked like chaos. A war also changes the meaning of youth. In peacetime, a 19-year-old can be dismissed as immature. In wartime, a 19-year-old can be handed a rifle and sent into combat. The contradiction was not lost on young people. They were told they were old enough to die, but not always old enough to vote. They were told to trust leaders who did not have to patrol the jungle themselves. They were told to be brave by men who spoke from podiums, offices and television studios. This did not mean the soldiers themselves lacked bravery. Many showed extraordinary courage and loyalty to one another under impossible conditions, but that only sharpened the moral pain. Young men were being asked to be brave inside a war whose purpose seemed less clear each year. The honour of soldiers and the wisdom of the war were not the same thing, though Americans argued as if they had to be. The soldiers who went to Vietnam were not separate from the generation that rebelled. They were part of it. Some were patriotic, some were doubtful. Some became disillusioned only after arriving. Some opposed the war before they were sent and went anyway. Some returned angry at protesters who they felt had insulted their sacrifice. Others returned and joined the anti-war movement, bringing with them a credibility no college student could easily match. Vietnam veterans against the war would become some of the most powerful voices in the movement because they disrupted the easy claim that opposition meant cowardice. A veteran could say, "I was there." A veteran could describe what policy sounded like when it became gunfire, heat, fear, confusion, and loss. For families watching from home, the war produced a strange mixture of pride, dread, and helplessness. A mother whose son was deployed might support the war publicly because she needed his service to mean something. To doubt the war too openly could feel like doubting the value of his danger. A father might defend the government because admitting the war was wrong would mean admitting his son had been placed at risk for reasons that did not hold. Brothers and sisters listened to arguments without knowing what to believe. Some families placed blue stars in windows. Some received the knock at the door. Some watched their sons come home quieter than before, unable to explain what had happened in terms the family could hold. Some watched sons return to a country that did not know how to welcome them properly, because the war itself had become too bitter. The television made this bitterness more visible. Each evening Americans saw pieces of the war and then heard officials explain them. At first, many believed the officials. Trust in government had not yet collapsed to the degree it would later. But credibility is not destroyed all at once. It erodes. It erodes when the public is told that success is near and then sees escalation. It erodes when casualty numbers rise. It erodes when maps, charts, and press briefings cannot produce a sense of actual victory. It erodes when soldiers and journalists tell stories that do not match official optimism. It erodes when the government seems more committed to avoiding embarrassment than telling the truth. By the late 1960s, the phrase credibility gap had entered American political language, and it captured a widening suspicion that the people in charge were not simply mistaken, but misleading. The Tet Offensive in 1968 became a turning point in this suspicion. Militarily, its meaning was complex, and historians still explain that the offensive did not produce the straightforward battlefield victory for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong that many Americans assumed from the shock of the images. But politically and psychologically, the effect in the United States was enormous. Americans had been told that progress was being made, that the enemy was weakening, that there was light ahead. Then came coordinated attacks across South Vietnam, including images that suggested the enemy was far from broken. For viewers at home, the precise military interpretation mattered less than the feeling that official confidence had been exposed as unreliable. If things were going so well, how could this happen? That same year, 1968, seemed to gather every American fear into one long public unravelling. Vietnam intensified. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Cities burned in grief and rage. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June while campaigning for the presidency. Protesters and police clashed outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August, and television again carried the images into American homes. The phrase "the whole world is watching," shouted by protesters, captured the new reality of politics in the television age. The whole world was not watching everything, but enough people were watching enough to make images part of the battle itself. Police batons, tear gas, bloodied faces, flags, chants, reporters, cameras, all merged into a national argument over who represented America and who was betraying it. For the counterculture, Vietnam confirmed the suspicion that American institutions were morally compromised. The government spoke of democracy while supporting destruction abroad. Universities conducted research tied to the military. Corporations profited from defense contracts. Police enforced order against protesters. News broadcasts carried violence but could not always explain the deeper systems behind it. To many young radicals, the war was not an isolated mistake. It was the visible symptom of a larger disease: militarism, imperial ambition, racism, corporate power, and obedience disguised as patriotism. This analysis could be sharp, but it could also become sweeping and careless. Some activists began to see every institution as equally corrupt, every compromise as betrayal, every opponent as enemy. The war radicalized people not only because it was violent, but because it seemed to reveal hidden connections everywhere. Music carried this radicalization in a form that could travel faster than speeches. Anti-war songs moved through campuses, coffee houses, festivals, bedrooms, and barracks. Some were direct, naming the war and condemning it plainly. Others expressed exhaustion, alienation, grief, or distrust without functioning as slogans. The point was not simply that songs persuaded people politically, it was that they gave emotional permission. A young person hearing a song of protest could feel that private anger had become public sound. A soldier hearing the same music might feel seen in his confusion, or offended by what seemed like judgment from people who had not been there. Music did not unify the generation. It gave its divisions a soundtrack. Inside the military itself, the culture of the 1960s did not stop at the base gates. Soldiers listened to rock music. They read underground newspapers. They used drugs. They argued about the war. Racial tensions inside the armed forces reflected tensions at home. Some troops wore peace symbols. Some wrote letters full of patriotism and duty. Some counted days until they could leave. The idea that America was divided between clean-cut soldiers and long-haired protesters is too simple. The division ran through families, campuses, churches, neighborhoods, and even the military itself. Vietnam was not only a war overseas, it was a pressure system that moved through nearly every American institution. The presence of the war in the living room also changed the relationship between seeing and responsibility. Once images were visible, what was the viewer supposed to do with them? A person could turn off the television, but turning it off did not answer the question. Did watching create obligation? Did knowledge require action? Could an ordinary citizen claim innocence if the war continued in their name? These questions haunted many young Americans. The war made spectatorship feel morally unstable. To sit comfortably at home while others fought and died, while Vietnamese civilians suffered beyond what most broadcasts fully conveyed, became harder for some to bear. Protest offered one way to transform helpless watching into action, but protest also produced backlash. Many Americans saw anti-war demonstrations not as conscience but as disrespect, especially when protests included burned flags, mocking chants, or hostility towards soldiers. For families with sons in Vietnam, such images could feel like a personal insult. For people who believed communism was a real and expanding threat, protesters seemed naive at best and dangerous at worst. For Americans who valued order after years of social upheaval, campus unrest confirmed that the country was losing discipline. Politicians understood this anger and used it. The language of the silent majority drew power from people who felt that television showed too many protesters and not enough of those who worked, served, paid taxes, and loved their country quietly. So the war did not simply turn America against itself. It revealed different Americas that had already been forming. One America believed national strength required unity, sacrifice, and trust in leadership, even when the situation was painful. Another believed the war proved that leadership had forfeited trust and that unity without conscience was complicity. One America looked at protesters and saw spoiled children. Another looked at soldiers and saw victims of a dishonest system. One America looked at the flag and saw the sacrifices of the past. Another looked at the flag and saw the crimes of the present. Both claimed the country. Both claimed moral seriousness. That is why the conflict became so bitter. For young men personally facing the draft, the moral language could become unbearable. Some complied because they believed it was their duty. Some complied because they were afraid not to. Some resisted quietly through deferments, medical claims, or bureaucratic manoeuvring. Some became conscientious objectors, trying to prove that their opposition was moral or religious rather than merely self-protective. Some burned draft cards in public acts of defiance. Some fled to Canada or Sweden, some went to prison. Each choice carried judgment. Those who went could be called killers by radicals or fools by cynics. Those who resisted could be called cowards by patriots or heroes by activists. No choice escaped the war's moral machinery. The counterculture absorbed this tension and turned it into one of its deepest convictions, that the personal and the political could not be separated. Hair, clothing, music, sex, drugs, diet, housing, education, race, gender, and war all seem connected because the same authority structures appeared to govern them. The father at the dinner table, the dean at the university, the police officer at the protest, the general in Vietnam, the president on television, the minister in the pulpit, the boss in the office, all could be seen as parts of one larger system demanding obedience. This way of seeing could illuminate real patterns of power. It could also flatten differences and make negotiation difficult. But in the atmosphere of the war, it made emotional sense. If the government could send young men to die for reasons that seemed false, why should its authority be trusted anywhere else? There is a quieter human scene inside all of this that deserves attention. A young man receives his draft notice. Maybe he is 19, maybe 21. The envelope is ordinary. That is part of the horror. History often arrives in plain paper. He opens it at a kitchen table, or in a dormitory hallway, or beside a mailbox while the afternoon continues around him. Cars pass. Someone laughs in another room. A dog barks. The world does not stop to honour the moment when his future changes. He reads the words and feels his body become government property in a way it had not been a minute earlier. His mother may cry. His father may tell him to stand straight. His girlfriend may go quiet. His friends may ask what he's going to do, as if the options are clear. That one envelope contains the whole decade in miniature. State power, family expectation, masculinity, fear, patriotism, resistance, class privilege, and the question of whether a young person's life belongs first to himself or to the nation. Now, place that scene beside another. A family watches the evening news. They see a village burning. They see soldiers younger than the father was when he first became a parent. They see Vietnamese civilians running, though the broadcast may not linger long enough for the viewers to learn their names or histories. They see officials speak afterward with calm confidence. The father says the country must finish what it started. The son says the country should never have started. The mother asks them not to argue during dinner. The younger sister listens and learns that politics is not distant. It is sitting at the table, raising its voice. The television has done what television often does in history. It has taken a public event and made it domestic. By the late 1960s, the war had become one of the great engines of distrust in American life. It did not act alone. Civil rights struggles, assassinations, generational conflict, feminism, police violence, and cultural change all mattered. But Vietnam gave the counterculture a central moral wound. It made the cost of obedience visible. It forced young people to decide whether they believed the men who governed them. It turned the living room into a place where official language could be tested against filmed reality. It made the distance between parent and child wider, because the older generation's memories of necessary war collided with the younger generation's experience of questionable war. It made the body political because the draft could claim it. It made television political because the images would not stay quiet. And all the while, the war continued. That is the part that must not be lost beneath the American story of protest and division. The war continued in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Vietnamese civilians lived with devastation on a scale most American viewers only partly understood. American soldiers lived with fear, heat, exhaustion, moral confusion, and grief. Families on both sides of the ocean waited for the next report, the next letter, the next knock, the next absence. The counterculture's opposition to the war became central to its identity, but the war was never merely a symbol. It was a lived catastrophe, and symbols do not bleed. People do. As Vietnam entered the living room, it also entered the mirror. Young Americans looked at their country and then looked at themselves. What did it mean to be American if America could do this? What did it mean to be free if freedom included being drafted? What did it mean to support the troops if supporting them seemed to require opposing the policy that endangered them? What did courage look like? Going, refusing, protesting, enduring, speaking, staying silent. The old answers did not disappear, but they no longer satisfied everyone. The war had made too much visible. Once that visibility took hold, the rest of the counterculture became harder to dismiss as mere fashion. The refusal of ordinary clothing, ordinary hair, ordinary careers, ordinary speech, and ordinary manners was tied to a deeper refusal of the world that had produced the war. If the men in clean suits could authorize napalm, body counts, and villages turned into ruins, then clean suits no longer looked like moral seriousness. If polite language could hide violence, then politeness itself became suspect. If official respectability could coexist with destruction, then disrespect might begin to feel like honesty. That is how a war fought thousands of miles away helped transform the meaning of a haircut, a song, a protest sign, a college occupation, and a young person's decision to step outside the life prepared for them. The sound that followed was not only shouting, it was also music, and that matters because the counterculture did not spread through political argument alone. It spread through feeling, through rhythm, through voices coming out of radios and record players, through concerts where thousands of young people discovered that their private unease could become a public atmosphere. Vietnam gave the rebellion urgency, but music gave it a body people could enter together. Before many young Americans could explain exactly what they opposed, they could recognize the sound of refusal. They could hear it in a guitar, in a rough voice, in a lyric that made parents frown, in a drumbeat that made stillness impossible. The war had entered the living room through television. The rebellion would enter it through the record player, through clothing, through hair, through the visible signs that a generation was learning to speak in ways the old order could not easily control. The rebellion did not always begin with a speech. Sometimes it began with a sound coming through a bedroom door, a guitar line too loud for the hour, a voice that did not sound polished in the approved way, a rhythm that made the body move before the mind had decided whether movement was allowed. Parents could tell when something had changed, even if they could not name it yet. They heard it from upstairs, from the garage, from transistor radios carried to the beach, from record players in dorm rooms, from cars parked at drive-ins with the windows cracked open. The music did not ask permission to enter the house. It slipped in under the door and made itself at home. That is one of the reasons music became so central to the counterculture. It did not require a manifesto. It did not require a meeting. It did not require anyone to understand foreign policy, civil rights law, university governance, or the long history of American conformity. A song could reach a teenager before politics did. It could take a feeling that had been private, shapeless, and slightly embarrassing and make it audible. Restlessness had a sound. Desire had a sound. Anger had a sound. Loneliness had a sound. The wish to leave home, or at least leave the version of a home that had already been planned, had a sound. Adults often dismissed this as noise because in a sense they understood it perfectly. Noise is what order calls a language it does not want to learn. Before the 1960s reached its full force, American youth culture had already been changed by rock and roll. The 1950s had introduced a generation to music that felt physical in a new public way, tied to rhythm and dancing and teenage desire. It drew heavily from black musical traditions, especially rhythm and blues, often in a country still structured by segregation and racial theft. White performers could become national stars by carrying sounds that black artists had helped create under conditions of discrimination. That contradiction sat inside American popular music from the beginning. The music promised freedom, but the industry and the culture around it did not distribute that freedom equally. Still, for young listeners, rock and roll opened something. It made the teenage body harder to discipline. It made the living room less quiet. It made parents nervous because it suggested that youth might no longer be a brief waiting room before adulthood, but a territory with its own loyalties. By the early 1960s, another sound was spreading through coffee houses, college campuses, and small clubs. Folk music seemed quieter than rock and roll, but quiet does not always mean obedient. A singer with an acoustic guitar could stand before an audience and sound almost plain, almost old-fashioned, yet carry questions that were deeply dangerous to the official story. The folk revival connected young people to older traditions of labour songs, spirituals, union organising, rural ballads, and protest music. It gave them a way to imagine themselves not as isolated rebels, but as part of a longer American argument over justice, work, race, war, and power. In places like Greenwich Village, young musicians, writers, students, and wanderers gathered in cramped rooms where smoke hung in the air and conversation stretched late into the night. Some of it was serious. Some of it was performative. Some of it was young people trying on depth like a new coat. But even that mattered, because trying on a new self is often the first stage of becoming one. Bob Dylan's early songs became part of this world not because he single-handedly created protest music, but because he arrived at the moment when many young listeners were ready to hear questions sung back to them. His voice did not sound like the smooth voices older popular music had trained people to expect. It was nasal, rough, insistent, sometimes weary, sometimes mocking, sometimes prophetic in a way that made him uncomfortable later, when others tried to turn him into a prophet. The important thing is not that every listener understood every reference. The important thing is that the songs made moral unease feel shareable. A young person who could not yet argue with a father about civil rights or nuclear weapons could listen to a record and feel that someone, somewhere, had already begun the argument. Then the music changed again. It became louder, electric, stranger, more expansive. The British invasion brought new energy into American youth culture, and the Beatles in particular transformed not only popular music but the emotional weather of being young. At first, they seemed almost cheerful enough to be safe, though parents still worried about the hair, the screaming girls, the speed with which the young attached themselves to the group. But their public evolution through the decade mirrored the decade itself. They moved from polished suits and bright harmonies into experimentation, studio complexity, Indian influences, psychedelic imagery, and lyrics that suggested interior exploration rather than simple romance. Millions of young people heard those changes not as isolated artistic choices, but as permission. The most famous band in the world was refusing to stay fixed. Why should anyone else? The Rolling Stones offered something rougher, more openly defiant, less interested in reassuring adults. Their image carried danger even when that danger was partly staged. That was part of the point. Youth culture in the 1960s learned that image could disturb authority almost as effectively as argument. A sneer, a slouch, a leather jacket, a pair of boots, a deliberately unpolished performance could all say no before anyone spoke. This was not meaningless. The post-war culture had placed enormous value on presentation. Respectability was visual. A clean haircut, pressed shirt, polished shoes, modest dress, controlled posture, and polite speech all worked as signals that a person understood the rules. Countercultural style reversed the signal. It made refusal visible from across the street. Long hair on men became one of the most famous and strangely intense battlefields of the decade. From a distance, it can seem absurd that so much anger gathered around hair. But hair is rarely just hair when a culture is anxious. In mid-century America, short hair on men suggested discipline, military readiness, corporate seriousness, hygiene, heterosexual normality, and respect for authority. Long hair disrupted all of that at once. To many adults, it looked feminine, dirty, childish, foreign, or subversive. It suggested that a young man was stepping away from the chain that led from boyhood to military service, job, marriage, fatherhood, and obedience. Parents and school administrators did not need a political essay to understand the challenge. They saw it at breakfast. A son letting his hair grow could turn an ordinary household into a courtroom. The father might say it looked disgraceful. The mother might plead for compromise before the grandparents visited. The school might threaten punishment. The boy might insist it was his own head, which sounded simple, but raised a larger question no one in the kitchen wanted to answer directly. How much of a young person's body belonged to the family, the school, the church, the employer, the military, or the country? A haircut argument could become an argument about sovereignty. That is why it felt so heated. The body had become political before anyone used that phrase with confidence. For women, clothing and appearance carried different but equally heavy meanings. The respectable femininity of the 1950s had emphasized neatness, grooming, figure control, and careful presentation. Hair set properly, waist defined, makeup applied, skirt appropriate, stockings worn, body managed. A young woman who rejected those expectations could be accused not only of bad taste, but of moral failure. Countercultural dress offered alternatives, though not always simple ones. Bare feet, loose dresses, jeans, work shirts, beads, shawls, embroidered jackets, second-hand clothing, and natural hair all pushed against the polished image of the suburban daughter or the office-ready young woman. Some women found real relief in stepping away from the labour of constant presentation. Others discovered that the counterculture created its own expectations, its own eroticised version of naturalness, its own demands that women be available, beautiful, relaxed, and supportive in new ways. Freedom in clothing did not automatically mean freedom in life, but it opened a visible argument. Jeans became especially important because they carried a history different from middle-class respectability. They were work clothes associated with labour, miners, farmers, cowboys, mechanics, and the practical roughness of the American landscape. When middle-class students and young rebels adopted jeans as everyday wear, they were rejecting the polished surfaces of suburban and corporate life. They were also borrowing from working-class imagery, sometimes with admiration, and sometimes with an innocence that actual working-class people could find irritating. A young person from a comfortable background could wear worn denim as a symbol of authenticity, while someone who had worn work clothes out of necessity might see no romance in them at all. Countercultural style often carried this tension. It searched for honesty by borrowing from people whose lives were not costumes. Military clothing also entered the language of refusal in strange ways. Army jackets, surplus coats, and field gear appeared on protesters who opposed the war. This could look contradictory, but it made a certain kind of sense. Wearing military surplus allowed young people to drain the clothing of its official meaning and turned it into critique. A jacket meant for discipline and command could be worn open, decorated, patched, softened, made ironic. It could honour soldiers while condemning the war, or mock militarism, or simply provide cheap, durable clothing. The meanings shifted depending on who wore it and how. That instability was part of the counterculture's visual power. Objects were taken from one system and made to speak in another accent. Tie-dye, beads, fringe, peasant blouses, sandals, headbands, and bright colours became part of the public image later attached to the hippie world. But those choices should not be treated only as decoration. They stood against the muted colours, straight lines, and controlled shapes of mainstream respectability. The corporate world had its greys, navy blues, whites, and polished blacks. The counterculture moved toward colour, texture, looseness, visible handwork, and global borrowing. Some of this reflected genuine interest in non-Western cultures, Native American traditions, Indian religion, Mexican textiles, African patterns, and folk craft. Some of it was careless appropriation, a young and often white middle-class search for spiritual and aesthetic alternatives that took symbols out of their original contexts. Both things can be true. The desire to escape American sameness was real. So was the blindness with which escape was sometimes pursued. Clothes also changed how people found one another. In a large city, on a campus, or at a concert, appearance worked like a signal. Long hair, certain jackets, beads, buttons, peace signs, and worn denim could tell a stranger that conversation might be possible. This mattered in a country where dissent could be isolating. A young person arriving in San Francisco, Berkeley, New York, Ann Arbor, Madison, Austin, or any number of college towns could read the street through clothing. Who might know where the meeting was? Who might have a place to stay? Who might know about the march, the concert, the underground paper, the commune outside town, the sympathetic lawyer, the doctor who would not ask too many questions, the record store where flyers were posted? Style created networks. It turned private recognition into public visibility. Buttons and slogans made this even clearer. A peace symbol pinned to a jacket was small, but it changed the way a person moved through the world. It invited approval and hostility. It made the body into a surface of speech. The peace symbol itself, originally designed in Britain for nuclear disarmament, became one of the most recognisable signs of the era. In America, it moved through anti-war activism, youth culture, fashion, and commerce. That movement tells us something about the counterculture's strength and weakness. Its symbols spread quickly because they were visually powerful and emotionally clear. But once symbols spread, they can be sold. A sign of resistance can become a necklace in a department store. A refusal can become a product. The counterculture would struggle with this from the beginning. It wanted to reject consumer society, but consumer society was very good at selling rebellion back to the rebels. Music faced the same problem. A song could criticise the system and still be pressed, packaged, advertised, distributed, and profited from by major companies. A rock star could condemn materialism while becoming rich. A festival could feel like a temporary community and still depend on contracts, ticket sales, promoters, security, and electricity. This did not make the music meaningless. It made it part of American capitalism, which was exactly the machine the counterculture both opposed and fed. The record industry discovered that anti-establishment feeling could be extremely profitable. Young people bought albums not only to hear songs, but to purchase identity, atmosphere, and belonging. A record collection became a kind of private map of the self. Still, we should not reduce the music to commerce. Its communal power was real. Concerts in the 1960s could feel to participants like gatherings of a new people, especially as the decade moved toward larger festivals and outdoor events. The experience of standing in a crowd, hearing amplified music, seeing bodies move without the controlled steps of formal dances, smelling grass, sweat, smoke, and rain, Watching performers who looked like the audience or like the audience's imagined future selves created a sense that another way of being together was possible. It did not always last. Crowds could be unsafe, exploitative, chaotic, or badly organised. But the feeling mattered because it gave physical form to the idea that the old order was not the only order. The dance itself changed. Earlier social dances had rules, partners, steps and patterns. By the 1960s, especially in rock settings, dancing could become more individual, freer, less tied to formal instruction. That shift may sound small, but the body remembers rules. A dance floor where people move in their own ways, not always paired, not always symmetrical, not always supervised, expresses a different social imagination. The body no longer waits for permission from a partner, parent, instructor, or tradition. It responds to sound. Adults could look at this and see chaos. Young people could feel release. Both perceptions came from the same scene. Radio carried the new culture into spaces where young people might otherwise have remained alone. The car radio deserves special attention because the car itself was one of the great tools of youth independence. A teenager with access to a car could leave the house, choose the station, meet friends, park somewhere beyond immediate supervision, and listen to music that seemed to turn the night into private territory. The automobile had been a symbol of post-war family success, but young people made it into a chamber of transition. Inside a car, between home and wherever they were not supposed to be, they could rehearse a different self. The radio made that rehearsal feel accompanied. Underground radio and later FM stations expanded this world. Unlike the tightly formatted pop radio of earlier years, some FM stations allowed longer tracks, stranger sounds, album cuts, political commentary, and a looser relationship between broadcaster and listener. The DJ could sound less like an announcer and more like someone awake with you at an unusual hour. That intimacy mattered. A voice in the dark introducing a song by Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Grateful Dead, or countless others could make a listener feel connected to a larger hidden country of people who were also awake, also restless, also unwilling to accept the daytime script. Jimi Hendrix's guitar made refusal sound like electricity under stress. Janis Joplin's voice made pain public without making it polite. The Grateful Dead built not just an audience but a travelling culture around improvisation and shared experience. The Doors gave some listeners a darker, theatrical language for desire and danger. Jefferson Airplane tied psychedelic sound to political and social unrest in ways that felt unmistakably of the moment. Motown and soul music, while not simply countercultural in the same white hippie sense, carried their own immense force, shaping the emotional life of the decade and crossing racial boundaries even when the country itself remained divided. Aretha Franklin's demand for respect was not a vague feeling. It landed in a culture where race, gender, labour, and dignity were all being contested. The music of the era was not one thing. It was a crowded argument with rhythm. Psychedelic music and art added another layer. Posters for concerts in San Francisco and elsewhere used distorted lettering, intense colour, swirling patterns, and visual density that seemed to reject the clean lines of corporate advertising while borrowing its attention-grabbing techniques. To read some posters, you had to slow down and let your eyes adjust. That was almost part of the message. The old world wanted clarity, efficiency, legibility, standardization. Psychedelic design offered overload, sensation, ambiguity, and altered perception. It looked like a refusal to see straight in a society that many young people believed had defined straightness too narrowly. Drugs, especially marijuana and psychedelics like LSD, became tied to this search for altered perception, though here again the story needs care. For some young people, drug use was casual pleasure, a way to relax, bond, listen to music, or irritate authority. For others, it was treated almost religiously, a tool for breaking through the ordinary ego and seeing reality differently. writers and figures associated with psychedelic experimentation spoke of expanded consciousness, spiritual awakening, and liberation from the mental habits of industrial society. Some users described genuine experiences of beauty, connection, and insight. Others experienced fear, confusion, dependency, or harm. The counterculture often underestimated the dangers because it wanted so badly to believe that changing consciousness could change the world. Sometimes it opened minds, sometimes it damaged them, sometimes it did both in the same community. Adults tended to collapse all of this into a single picture of moral decline: the music, the hair, the clothes, the drugs, the sex, the protests, the disrespect. To them, these were not separate choices but signs of a broad refusal to grow up. And to be fair, some people inside the counterculture did use freedom as an excuse for irresponsibility. Some treated other people carelessly. Some mistook rejection of rules for wisdom. Some believed that feeling intensely was the same as understanding deeply. But if we stop there, we miss the historical significance. The visible culture of the 1960s mattered because it gave young people tools to separate themselves from the old order before they had fully built a new one. It allowed them to say no with their bodies, rooms, records, and daily habits. The bedroom became a small countercultural territory. Posters on the wall, records stacked near the player, incense, books, beads, a guitar in the corner, maybe a mattress on the floor, maybe a college schedule, maybe an anti-war flyer, maybe a photograph of a musician whose face had become more familiar than the faces of certain relatives. Parents stepping into such rooms often felt they had entered a foreign country inside their own house. That feeling was not accidental. The young were building symbolic borders. They needed spaces where the old meanings weakened. A room could not transform society, but it could protect the first fragile version of a different self. Language changed too. Slang, humour, irony, and deliberate informality separated young people from the speech of parents, teachers, and officials. Words like hip, straight, scene, trip, freak, establishment, and many others helped map social reality. To call someone straight was not simply to describe sexual orientation in the later sense. It meant conventional, obedient, trapped inside official expectations. To call something a scene meant recognizing a social world with its own rules, people, atmosphere, and possibilities. Language created belonging. It also created exclusion, and the counterculture could be just as smug in its judgments as the mainstream it criticized. But the change in speech mattered because authority often depends on controlling the terms in which reality is described. Young people were inventing and borrowing terms that made adult respectability sound less inevitable. Even silence changed. Refusal did not always appear as shouting. Sometimes it was a young man declining to stand quite straight when an adult expected him to. A young woman no longer laughing politely at jokes that diminished her. A student wearing jeans to a place where a skirt or jacket had once been assumed. A group of friends sitting on the grass instead of in the approved seating. A couple holding hands in public across lines their families did not accept. A soldier painting a peace sign on a helmet. A teenager turning the volume up when a parent had said, "Turn that garbage down." These gestures were small, but repeated by millions of people, they altered the atmosphere of public life. This is why the quiet language of refusal was so difficult for institutions to control. A government could arrest protesters. A school could suspend students. A parent could order a haircut. A police officer could break up a gathering. But how do you stop a song from being loved? How do you stop young people from recognizing one another by clothing? How do you prevent a hairstyle from becoming a signal? How do you keep a guitar riff from travelling through a dormitory window? How do you stop a word from changing meaning once enough people use it differently? Culture moves in ways law cannot fully govern. That was one of the counterculture's great strengths. It spread through pleasure as well as politics. By the late 1960s, the visible signs of refusal had become impossible to ignore. Newspapers photographed them. Television commentators worried over them. Politicians condemned or courted them. Businesses copied them. Parents argued about them. Churches preached against them. Schools regulated them. Police watched them. The image of the long-haired youth became a national symbol, admired by some, hated by others, misunderstood by nearly everyone at least some of the time. A whole generation was being judged by surfaces, but the surfaces had been chosen because they carried meaning. The old America had taught its children that appearance mattered. The children believed it and changed their appearance. Still, clothing and music could only carry a refusal so far. A record could make a person feel free for 40 minutes. A haircut could announce independence. A concert could create a temporary community. But the deeper question remained, how should life actually be lived after the old script had been rejected? If the suburban home felt false, what kind of home could replace it? If the nuclear family felt restrictive, what kind of family could be chosen? If the corporate career looked like surrender, how could people eat, work, raise children, and survive? If America's institutions were corrupt, could smaller communities be built outside them? These questions moved the counterculture from sound and style into experiments with daily life. The young had learned to signal refusal. Now some of them would try to build places where refusal could become routine, where the morning after the concert still belonged to a different world, where food, labour, love, shelter, money, authority and responsibility might be rearranged by hand. The question of where to live became more serious than it first sounded. At the beginning, leaving home might mean leaving a bedroom, a dinner table, a town, a set of parents who asked too many questions, a school that punished the wrong haircut, a church that seemed to confuse obedience with goodness, or a suburb where every street appeared to lead back to the same future. But once the door had closed behind you, once the bus had taken you west, or the college dormitory had become more familiar than your childhood room, the larger question arrived. If the old home was not enough, what would replace it? This was one of the deepest problems of the counterculture, because rejection is easier than construction. It is one thing to say no to the house with the trimmed lawn, the father's commute, the mother's quiet exhaustion, the polite neighbours, the Sunday clothes, the mortgage, the draft board, the career ladder, and the television glowing in the corner. It is another thing to wake up on a cold morning in a farmhouse with 15 other people and decide who is going to chop wood, who is going to cook breakfast, who is going to clean the latrine, who is going to speak to the landlord, who has money for groceries, who is caring for the sick child in the next room, and who has disappeared because freedom, it turns out, does not automatically wash dishes. The counterculture wanted a different kind of home, and in its most sincere moments that desire was not foolish. It came from a real hunger for community, honesty, shared labour, spiritual meaning, sexual openness, racial justice, ecological awareness, and escape from the loneliness hidden inside modern abundance. But homes are made out of daily responsibilities, not only ideals. That was the lesson many young Americans learned slowly, and sometimes painfully. Let us begin on campus, because for thousands of young people, the university was the first home that was not fully controlled by family. It was not freedom exactly. Universities had rules, deans, curfews, dormitory regulations, dress expectations, disciplinary boards, and a clear sense that students were still partly children under institutional supervision. But compared with home, a campus could feel wide open. A young person arrived with a suitcase, a stack of books, perhaps a typewriter, perhaps a record player, perhaps a family photograph tucked away where no one else would see it, and suddenly the world became crowded with people of the same age asking questions at the same time. That mattered enormously. Doubt is different when it has company. In the dormitory hallway, a student could hear music from 5 rooms at once. Someone was playing folk records. Someone else had discovered electric blues. Someone was arguing about civil rights. Someone was reading Marx for the first time and speaking as if no one had ever noticed capitalism before. Someone was reading Freud or James Baldwin or Simone de Beauvoir or Herbert Marcuse or the poetry of Allen Ginsberg. Someone was in love with a person their parents would not approve of. Someone had received a draft notice. Someone had gone south for voter registration work and come back quieter. Someone had taken LSD and was describing it with unbearable seriousness at 2 a.m. Someone else was trying to study chemistry and wished everyone would stop discovering themselves so loudly. This was campus life at its most intense. Not everywhere and not for everyone, but in enough places to matter. Universities had expanded rapidly after World War II, and by the 1960s they were carrying far more students than earlier generations had known. This expansion changed the social meaning of college. It was no longer only a finishing ground for elites, or a professional path for a small portion of the population. It became a mass institution, and mass institutions create mass frustrations. Students were told they were being educated for citizenship, leadership, and independent thought, but many campuses still treated them as dependent children. Administrators controlled where they could gather, what political groups could do, what speakers could appear, what rules governed dormitories, and how much say students had in the institutions that shaped their lives. The contradiction was obvious. A university praised inquiry in the classroom and punished it in the plaza. The free speech movement at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1964 became one of the clearest early examples of this contradiction breaking open. Students objected to restrictions on political activity on campus, especially activities connected to civil rights organising. The details involved tables, rules, property lines, administrative authority, and the seemingly small question of where students could advocate for causes. But the deeper issue was larger. Who had the right to speak inside a public university? Were students passive recipients of education? Or were they citizens with political responsibilities? When student activists surrounded a police car holding arrested former student Jack Weinberg and used the roof of the car as a speaking platform, the image captured something essential about the decade. A vehicle of authority had become a stage for dissent. The machinery of order had been turned into furniture for argument. For many students, campus activism began with concrete demands. Let us organise. Let us speak. Let us protest segregation. Let us question the war. Let us participate in decisions that affect us. But concrete demands often led to deeper analysis. If the university blocked political speech, what was the university really for? If it accepted military research money, was it part of the war machine? If it trained students for corporate careers, was education simply a polished entrance into the system? If it claimed neutrality in a world of racial injustice and war, was neutrality itself a political choice? These questions spread because universities gathered people with time to think, read, argue, and test the patience of authority. That mixture has always made institutions nervous. The campus was also a place where private life changed quickly. Young men and women lived near one another with less direct supervision than their parents had known. Rules remained, especially for women, whose dormitories often had stricter curfews and regulations than men's. But rules could be challenged, mocked, evaded, and eventually broken. A young woman who arrived expecting college to prepare her for marriage might encounter feminism, civil rights activism, anti-war politics, birth control, poetry, and other women who quietly admitted they wanted lives larger than the ones described in magazines. A young man who arrived expecting to become a lawyer, businessman, engineer, or officer might discover that the path ahead suddenly looked less like success and more like surrender. Not everyone changed. Many students studied, dated, graduated, married, and entered conventional lives. But enough changed to make the campus feel like one of the pressure chambers of American society. The university became a temporary home where young people learned that institutions could be confronted. They held meetings that went on far too long. They produced leaflets by the thousands. They occupied buildings. They debated words with an intensity that could exhaust even those who agreed with the cause. They formed committees, coalitions, factions, and factions inside factions. They learned how difficult democracy becomes when everyone wants a voice and no one wants to be told to stop talking. This too was education. The counterculture often dreamed of community without hierarchy, but meetings revealed that even anti-hierarchical people need structure, or else the loudest, most confident, and most tireless simply become rulers without titles. Campus politics connected with the broader counterculture, but the relationship was complicated. Some activists saw hippies as unserious, more interested in getting high than building power. Some hippies saw political radicals as tense, angry, and trapped in the same logic of confrontation they claimed to oppose. There were overlaps, of course. People moved between marches, concerts, communes, classrooms, and underground newspapers. A student might attend an anti-war rally in the afternoon, hear a band in the evening, sleep on someone's floor, wake up late, and spend the next day arguing about whether personal liberation and political revolution were the same thing. The fact that this question could be treated as urgent tells us a great deal about the period. The counterculture did not only ask how to change laws, it asked how to change daily life. Communes were one answer, or at least one attempt at an answer. They grew from many sources: older American traditions of utopian communities, religious experiments, socialist settlements, back to the land movements, pacifist communities, anarchist theory, native and non-Western ideas often imperfectly understood, beat restlessness, ecological concern, anti-war rejection, and the simple desire of young people to live together without parents, landlords, bosses, or suburban loneliness. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, thousands of communal experiments existed across the United States in cities, rural areas, mountain valleys, deserts, old farms, and cheap houses near campuses. Some lasted only a few weeks. Some lasted years. A few survived in altered form for decades. Most lived somewhere between sincere experiment and barely managed chaos. The word commune can make the whole thing sound more organised than it often was. Some communities had clear principles, shared labour systems, rules for money, childcare, agriculture, meetings, conflict, visitors, and membership. Others were simply overcrowded houses full of young people with mattresses on the floor, music playing at odd hours, dishes stacked in the sink, someone's dog wandering through, someone's baby crying, someone's friend from Oregon sleeping in the hallway, and no one quite sure who had paid the rent. Both kinds belonged to the era. The dream could be profound. The practice could be exhausting. The rural commune held a special appeal because it seemed to answer several countercultural complaints at once. The city was polluted, commercial, policed, expensive, and tied to the industrial system. The suburb was artificial and emotionally deadening. The countryside promised land, food, simplicity, physical labour, and escape from consumer society. Young people who had grown up with supermarkets and appliances began to romanticize growing their own vegetables, baking bread, chopping wood, repairing barns, raising goats, and living close to the seasons. Some had real skills, many did not. The distance between reading about self-sufficiency and surviving a winter is considerable. Picture a group of young people arriving at a rundown farm sometime around 1969. They may have bought it cheaply, or rented it from someone willing to ignore how many people were actually living there. The house has drafts, bad plumbing, an unreliable stove, and rooms that seemed large during the first excited walkthrough, but feel smaller once everyone's belongings are inside. There is land, which looks like freedom until weeds, stones, fences, mud, and broken tools make clear that land is not an idea. Someone has brought seeds, someone has brought a guitar, someone has brought books about organic farming, Buddhism, radical politics, or communal child-rearing. Someone has brought no money but great confidence. Someone has brought practical knowledge and will quietly become essential. The first nights may feel magical. The stars are bright. The old world seems far away. The fire burns. People talk about building a new society from the ground up. Then morning comes and the fire is out. The waterline has frozen and half the group is still asleep. This is not to mock them. Many were trying earnestly to solve a real problem. Modern American life had become specialised, bureaucratic, and separated from the sources of its own comfort. Food appeared in stores. Heat came from systems hidden in walls. Clothing came from factories. Entertainment came through screens and speakers. Work often took place far from home. The counterculture's back to the land impulse was partly an attempt to reconnect action and consequence. Grow food and eat it. Build a table and sit at it. Share childcare with people you know. Make music in the same room where people sleep. Repair what breaks. Know where your waste goes. Know who needs help. This desire was not silly. It anticipated later concerns about industrial food, environmental damage, alienation, and the loss of community. But idealism did not erase human difficulty. Communes faced problems that every community faces, often intensified by youth, poverty, inexperience, and weak structure. Who decided what counted as fair labour? What happened when some people worked hard and others preferred to discuss consciousness? Who controlled money? Could private property exist? Could couples have privacy? What did sexual freedom mean when jealousy, pregnancy, disease, coercion, and unequal power entered the room? Who cared for children when everyone was supposed to be free? How were conflicts resolved if authority itself was suspect? How did a community remove someone dangerous without becoming the kind of coercive system it opposed? These questions were not theoretical for the people living inside them. They arrived as arguments over dinner, tears in the yard, tense meetings, broken friendships, and people leaving in the middle of the night. Gender was one of the most revealing failures. The counterculture spoke often of liberation, but women frequently discovered that old expectations followed them into supposedly new worlds. Someone still had to cook, clean, care for children, comfort men in crisis, type manuscripts, organise meetings, tend gardens, and keep track of the details that made daily life possible. Too often that someone was female. A man who rejected corporate America might still expect a woman to make breakfast. A male radical could denounce hierarchy in public and dominate meetings in private. A musician or guru or charismatic commune founder could speak of love while taking advantage of young women drawn to his confidence. This contradiction helped push many women toward feminism. They learned, through experience, that liberation movements could reproduce the inequalities they claimed to oppose. Children raised in communal settings had mixed experiences. Some found warmth, freedom, nature, many adults who cared for them, and a sense of belonging wider than the nuclear family. Others experienced neglect, instability, unclear boundaries, poverty, unsafe adults, and the confusion of living inside experiments designed more around adult ideals than children's needs. The counterculture often criticised the traditional family for its secrecy, authority, and repression. It was right to see real damage there, but creating alternatives required more than declaring all adults equal and all love shared. Children need care that is consistent, not only sincere. They need food, sleep, safety, attention, and adults who remember that freedom for the grown can become uncertainty for the young. Urban communes and collective houses faced a different set of conditions. In neighborhoods of San Francisco, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Berkeley, and other cities, young people created shared households tied to political organizing, art, music, underground newspapers, food co-ops, free clinics, legal aid, and anti-war work. These spaces could be lively, generous, and chaotic. They functioned as informal support systems for people arriving with little money. A newcomer might find a floor to sleep on, a meal, advice about avoiding the draft, a ride to a protest, a used coat, or someone who knew a sympathetic doctor. This kind of mutual aid was one of the counterculture's real achievements. It built practical networks in the shadow of institutions many young people distrusted. The Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco became the most famous symbol of this world, especially during the Summer of Love in 1967. But fame itself changed the place. What had been a developing local scene of music, cheap housing, artists, activists, and experimenters became a destination for thousands of young people drawn by media images of freedom. Some arrived with plans, many arrived with almost nothing. The neighbourhood struggled to absorb them. Housing became scarce. Food was needed. Medical care was needed. Bad drugs circulated. Runaways appeared, some very young and vulnerable. Predators followed the idealists. The dream of open community collided with the reality of mass arrival. The diggers and other groups tried to provide free food, free stores, street theatre, and mutual aid, treating free services not as charity, but as a challenge to capitalism itself. Their work showed both the generosity and the limits of the scene. A neighbourhood could welcome many people, but not endlessly, and not without organisation. That is one of the ironies running through the search for a different kind of home. The counterculture often distrusted institutions, but wherever it succeeded even briefly, it had to invent institution-like structures. Free clinics needed schedules, supplies, trained people, records and responsibilities. Food cooperatives needed accounting, distribution, storage, and rules. Underground newspapers needed editors, printers, money, deadlines, and decisions about what to publish. Communes needed labour systems, conflict resolution, and membership boundaries. Campus movements needed meetings, strategy, legal defence, and communication. The old world had been rejected partly because it was too structured, but the absence of structure did not produce automatic harmony. It often produced hidden structure, and hidden structure could be less accountable than formal authority. Underground newspapers became a kind of home in print. They connected scattered scenes, published anti-war reporting, poetry, cartoons, music notices, police warnings, sexual advice, political theory, and local gossip. Their pages were often messy, crowded, angry, funny, crude, inventive, and alive. They gave young people a way to see themselves as part of a national and international movement. A student in one city could read about protests in another. A runaway could find information. A musician could advertise a show. A radical group could publish a statement. A collective could ask for supplies. The paper itself might be produced in a cramped room full of smoke, unpaid labour, arguments, and last-minute corrections. But when it appeared on the street, it made the movement visible to itself. The search for another home also took spiritual forms. Many young Americans had grown up in churches or synagogues that seemed, to them, too tied to respectability, nationalism, or social control. They went looking elsewhere. Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, native spiritual practices, astrology, meditation, occultism, communal Christianity, new religious movements, and forms of mysticism that promised direct experience rather than inherited doctrine. Some of this seeking was serious and disciplined. Some was shallow, exoticizing, or confused. But the hunger behind it should be understood. The counterculture did not only reject politics, it rejected the feeling that modern life had become spiritually thin. A suburban church service could feel to some young people like another script. Meditation, chanting, communal worship, or psychedelic spirituality seemed to offer contact with something unprocessed by institutions. This spiritual search often overlapped with the ecological imagination. Living differently meant living on the earth differently. Rachel Carson's work in the early 1960s had helped expose the dangers of pesticides and the arrogance of assuming nature could absorb unlimited chemical assault. The growing environmental movement found receptive listeners among young people already suspicious of industrial society. Communes, organic gardening, vegetarian diets, recycling experiments, handmade goods, and anti-consumerist habits all carried ecological meaning, even when practiced inconsistently. The first Earth Day in 1970 would show that environmental concern was not confined to hippie enclaves, but the counterculture helped give it a daily lifestyle. What you ate, how you travelled, what you bought, what you threw away, and whether you knew how to grow anything became moral questions. College campuses also became homes for movements beyond the white middle-class counterculture most often remembered in popular imagery. Black student unions challenged universities over admissions, curriculum, faculty hiring, community accountability, and the creation of Black Studies programs. Chicano student movements organised around educational access, farm worker solidarity, land rights, and cultural pride. Native activists challenged the colonial foundations of American history and contemporary policy. Asian American student activism grew in connection with anti-war politics and ethnic studies. Feminist groups formed consciousness-raising circles, where women described personal experiences and discovered political patterns. Gay liberation, especially after the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, began creating public communities of resistance and survival. These movements overlapped with the counterculture, but also criticised its blind spots. They asked whose freedom was being imagined, whose history was being ignored, and who was expected to provide the labour while others performed liberation. The campus could hold all of this because it was both sheltered and exposed. Students had some protection from immediate economic pressures, especially those from middle-class families, but they were also close to the draft, police, university discipline, and national politics. A campus was a home with gates that could be entered by the state. When police came onto campuses, when students were beaten or arrested, when buildings were occupied, when classes shut down, the question of who owned the university became impossible to avoid. Was it the trustees, the state, the faculty, the students, the public, the corporations that funded research, the military that recruited there? The struggle over campus space was a struggle over the future. Whoever controlled the campus helped shape the generation being trained to inherit the country. The most intense campus confrontations could turn deadly, as the country saw at Kent State in 1970, when National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students during protests after the US expansion of the war into Cambodia. That moment belongs slightly beyond the core 1960s, but it grew directly from the conflicts of the decade. The image of students killed on an American campus shocked the country because it collapsed the distance between foreign war and domestic unrest. The war had entered the living room, then the campus, then the bodies of students at home. For many young people, it confirmed their worst suspicions about state power. For others, it confirmed that protests had become dangerously unruly. Again, the same event deepened opposite convictions. The search for a different kind of home was never one thing. For some, it meant a campus movement disciplined by political strategy. For others, it meant a rural commune, shared bread, and a garden. For others, it meant a crash pad in the hate, a place to sleep before the next concert or march. For others, it meant a black cultural centre, a feminist apartment collective, a free clinic, a food co-op, a church basement organising meeting, a gay bar that offered danger and recognition at the same time, an underground newspaper office, a bookstore, a record shop, or simply a circle of friends sitting on the floor and telling the truth as they understood it. Home became less a fixed address than a question. Where can I live without lying? Where can I be seen? Where can I belong without becoming obedient to what I believe is false? Those questions were powerful because the old American home had always carried both comfort and control. The counterculture tried to keep the comfort and remove the control. It wanted warmth without patriarchy, belonging without conformity, work without exploitation, love without possession, sex without shame, spirituality without dogma, politics without bureaucracy, education without hierarchy, and community without repression. Stated that way, the ambition is almost breathtaking. It is also clear why it so often failed. Human beings carry old habits into new rooms. Power does not disappear because people stop using formal titles. Jealousy does not disappear because people speak of free love. Labour does not organise itself because money is criticised. Children do not raise themselves because adults reject the nuclear family. Illness, hunger, winter, rent, addiction, conflict, and exhaustion remain stubbornly practical. Yet failure is not the whole story. Some of these experiments left durable marks. Food cooperatives, free clinics, alternative schools, women's health collectives, environmental practices, communal farms, crisis hotlines, legal aid networks, independent presses, and new forms of therapy and spirituality all drew energy from this period. Some became absorbed into mainstream life, some remained marginal, some changed shape so much that their countercultural origins became hard to see. The attempt to live differently did not remake America in the way its dreamers hoped, but it did widen the range of what later Americans could imagine. It made questions about work, family, gender, food, medicine, education, mental health, sexuality, and environmental responsibility harder to confine to the private sphere. There is a scene that captures the whole attempt better than any slogan. It is early morning in a shared house or rural commune. The night before, people stayed up late talking about revolution, consciousness, music, love, the war, the old world, the new world, the lies of their parents, the failures of America, the possibility of living without domination. Now the room is colder than expected. Someone is making coffee badly. Someone is still asleep under a coat. A child is looking for breakfast. The sink is full. A visitor no one knows well is asking how long he can stay. There is a meeting later that everyone agrees is important and no one wants to attend. Outside, the garden needs work, or the rent needs paying, or the campus rally begins at noon. The dream has not vanished. It is simply standing in the kitchen, waiting to see whether anyone will do the necessary work. That is where the counterculture became most human. Not in the posters, not in the famous festivals, not in the photographs of beautiful young people sitting in the sun, but in the daily test of whether people could build the world they had imagined when no camera was present. Sometimes they could, often they could not. But the effort itself reveals what they were really rebelling against. They were not only rebelling against war, though war mattered. Not only against parents, though family conflict mattered. Not only against clothing rules, sexual rules, racial injustice, corporate life, or university authority, though all of these mattered. They were rebelling against the feeling that life had been organised elsewhere by people who assumed they knew what a human being needed. The commune, the campus occupation, the collective house, the free clinic, the underground paper, the food co-op, and the circle on the floor were all attempts to take ordinary life back into human hands. And this is why the search for a different kind of home leads naturally into the more difficult side of the story. Whenever people try to break rules, they discover which rules were merely oppressive and which existed because human beings are complicated. The counterculture opened doors that had been locked too long. It also opened doors without always asking who might be harmed on the other side. Freedom could become generosity, courage, honesty, and play. It could also become abandonment, selfishness, manipulation, and danger. The same movement that gave many people language for liberation also exposed them to new forms of confusion and exploitation. The search for a new home brought warmth, but it did not end trouble. In some places, it simply moved trouble into rooms where no one yet knew what to call it, and some of that trouble eventually made its way to Washington. Not only in letters, hearings, elections, court cases and military reports, but in bodies. Thousands of bodies. Then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Young people who had argued in dorm rooms, slept on commune floors, handed out leaflets outside draft boards, listened to protest songs in cars, marched through campuses, and sat up late trying to decide what kind of a life could still be honest eventually turned toward the capital, because the capital was where the country kept its official face. Washington was where the language of freedom was carved into stone. It was where presidents spoke from balconies and briefing rooms. It was where wars were funded, where laws were written, where police permits were granted or denied, where marble buildings seemed to say that history was orderly because powerful people preferred it to look that way. To arrive there as a protester in the 1960s was to walk into a city that belonged both to symbolism and ordinary routine. That is easy to forget. Washington was not just monuments and government buildings. It was also neighbourhoods, bus stops, lunch counters, churches, boarding houses, office workers, janitors, secretaries, waitresses, cab drivers, school children, local families, and federal employees who had to get to work whether or not the Republic was having a moral crisis that morning. The Capitol could look grand from a distance, but it was lived in at ground level. That was part of what made protest there so strange. A crowd might gather to challenge the moral direction of the nation, while a man carrying office papers tried to cross the street. A woman bought groceries, a child waited for a bus, and a policeman wondered how long his shift would run. The counterculture did not invent the idea of marching on Washington. Long before the young anti-war movement made the city one of its great stages, other Americans had understood that the Capitol mattered as theatre. Workers, veterans, suffragists, civil rights activists, religious groups and political organisations had gone there because Washington made demands visible to the nation. In 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom brought hundreds of thousands of people to the city in one of the most important public gatherings in American history. It is remembered now through Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, and rightly so, but the event was larger than one speech, and more disciplined than later memory sometimes allows. It was a massive, organised, carefully planned demonstration rooted in decades of black struggle, labour activism, church networks, civil rights organising, and pressure on the federal government. It was not a spontaneous festival of good feeling. It was a demand presented with moral clarity and logistical skill. That march mattered to the counterculture, even though it was not the same thing as the counterculture. Many young white activists later learned from the civil rights movement's use of disciplined public presence. They saw that bodies in Washington could change the national conversation. They saw that a crowd could be peaceful and still powerful, respectful and still confrontational, orderly and still impossible to ignore. They also saw the limits. After the speeches ended, after the songs faded, after people boarded buses home, Washington remained Washington. Congress did not instantly transform. Racism did not dissolve because a crowd had stood near the Lincoln Memorial. The city could absorb even a great day and return the next morning to procedure. That was one of the first lessons of the decade. A march could reveal truth. It could not, by itself, govern after sunset. Still, the image of citizens gathered before the monuments had enormous force. The Lincoln Memorial in particular carried a weight no indoor meeting could match. A speaker standing there was not simply speaking to an audience. He was speaking against a national backdrop that included slavery, civil war, emancipation, unfinished promises, and the long argument over who belonged inside the word American. The counterculture understood this instinctively. To protest in Washington was to use the country's own symbols as evidence. The marble did not belong only to presidents, generals, and official ceremonies. It could be occupied by the people who believed the official story had failed them. A young person standing on the Mall could look toward the Capitol and feel, maybe for the first time, that the government was not an abstraction. It was there, physically there, within walking distance, guarded but visible. By the time the Vietnam War became the central wound in American public life, Washington had become the place where private anger could be turned into national spectacle. Anti-war demonstrators came with signs, songs, banners, draft cards, flowers, guitars, leaflets, petitions, and the awkward mixture of fear and excitement that comes when people who have spoken against power from a distance finally stand near power's front door. Some came by bus from colleges, Some drove through the night in borrowed cars. Some arrived from churches, peace organisations, veterans groups and political clubs. Some looked like the public image of the counterculture. Long hair, denim, beads, army jackets, sandals, patched clothes. Others looked entirely conventional. Clergy in collars, mothers in coats, professors in ties, veterans in parts of old uniforms, older pacifists who had been opposing war since before many of the students were born. Washington revealed that the anti-war movement was wider than the stereotype, though television often preferred the stereotype because it was easier to film and easier to argue about. There is a scene that repeated itself in different forms during those years. It is early morning and buses are arriving near the Capitol. People step down, stiff from sleep, carrying blankets, paper bags, backpacks, signs rolled under their arms. They are hungry, excited, uncertain, and not quite sure where the bathrooms are. Someone has a map. Someone has lost the group already. Someone is singing before anyone has agreed that singing is happening. Police are visible at intersections. Organisers with armbands try to direct people. Vendors appear because wherever crowds gather, commerce comes too, even when the crowd has come to denounce the moral emptiness of commerce. Federal buildings stand silent in the morning light. The crowd is not yet a crowd. It is a scattered arrival, and then, slowly, it becomes a force. For many young protesters, this transformation was unforgettable. Alone, a person could feel foolish carrying a sign. Among thousands, the same sign felt like evidence. Alone, a chant could feel embarrassing. In a crowd, it became a rhythm that moved through the body. Alone, opposition to the war might make a student an irritant at home or on campus. In Washington, opposition became visible enough to frighten officials and comfort strangers. This is one of the reasons large demonstrations matter, even when they do not immediately change policy. They allow people to see the size of their own dissent. A government may count numbers for security reasons. Protesters count them for courage. But Washington also taught the movement what numbers could not do. A crowd could fill the mall and still find that the war continued. A march could make the evening news and still discover that the next morning's briefing used the same phrases as before. 100,000 voices could shout outside a building and still watch the men inside proceed according to calendars, committees, and chains of command. This did not make protest meaningless, but it did make the limits of symbolic politics painfully clear. The Capitol could be shaken, embarrassed, surrounded, and morally accused. It could also wait. Governments are good at waiting. They have offices, archives, procedures, security shifts, and budgets. Crowds have energy, bodies, weather, hunger, and buses scheduled to leave. The 1967 March on the Pentagon captured this collision between theatrical protest and institutional force with unusual clarity. The Pentagon was not like the Lincoln Memorial or the Capitol. It was not a sacred symbol of democratic promise. It was the military's administrative brain, a vast building of corridors, offices, maps, telephones, classified papers, and decisions that became orders far away. To march, there was to move from moral appeal toward confrontation with the machinery of war itself. The event drew a mix of anti-war activists, students, radicals, pacifists, clergy, and countercultural figures. Some protesters approached it with solemn opposition. Others brought street theatre, chanting, and an almost ritual desire to expose the building's power by treating it as absurd. There were even plans by some activists to symbolically levitate the Pentagon, a gesture that later became one of the era's most famous examples of the counterculture's blend of politics, humour, mysticism, and provocation. It is easy to laugh at that now. Many people laughed then. But the impulse behind it tells us something important. The Pentagon represented a form of authority so huge, technical, and deadly that ordinary political language seemed too weak to confront it. To speak to it in the language of reason alone felt insufficient. So some protesters used mockery, ritual, music, and spectacle. They tried to make the war machine look ridiculous because ridicule was one of the few weapons available to people without official power. At the same time, the soldiers and marshals facing them were not symbols to themselves. Many were young men too, some not much older than the protesters. They stood in lines, carrying rifles or wearing helmets, ordered to protect a building that represented policies they may or may not have understood or supported. Across the line, two versions of American youth looked at each other. That image matters. The counterculture often spoke as if the conflict were between young people and old authorities, but Vietnam placed young bodies on both sides of barricades. A student with long hair might place a flower in the barrel of a rifle held by a military policeman. The photograph could become iconic, but the human reality was more complicated. The soldier holding the rifle might be tired, frightened, bored, angry, or trying not to react. He might support the war or hate it. He might have friends in Vietnam. He might go there himself. The protester might be sincere, brave, naive, privileged, or all of these at once. A flower in a rifle barrel made a powerful image because it condensed the whole fantasy of the counterculture, that innocence, beauty, and refusal might disarm organized violence. Sometimes images tell emotional truths even when they do not describe how power actually works. After the crowd went home, the Pentagon remained. That is the hard sentence at the center of this story. The building did not float away. The war did not stop that night. The offices opened again. Papers moved. Phones rang. The floors were cleaned. Reports were typed. Men in uniform and suits returned to their desks. Some protesters were arrested. Some went back to campuses feeling stronger. Some went back feeling that peaceful protest was not enough. Some went back mostly remembering the music, the fear, the police, the size of the crowd, the strangeness of seeing the center of military power up close. Washington had given them an experience. It had not given them victory. That gap between experience and victory became one of the defining frustrations of the late 1960s. Demonstrations could create moments of unity so intense that participants believed history had shifted beneath their feet. Then Monday came. The same leaders remained in office. The same bombings continued. The same draft system operated. The same newspapers debated whether the protesters had been sincere, disorderly, communist, patriotic, spoiled, courageous, or obscene. The crowd had felt like a new country for a few hours. Then everyone had to return to the old one. The moratorium to end the war in Vietnam in October 1969 and the massive demonstrations that followed in November brought this tension to one of its highest points. By then, opposition to the war had spread far beyond the earliest activist circles. Students participated, but so did clergy, professionals, veterans, parents, and ordinary citizens who had grown weary of official assurances. In Washington, vast crowds gathered to mourn the dead, oppose the war, and pressure the Nixon administration. The atmosphere included grief as well as anger. Names of the dead were read. Candles were carried. The war was no longer a distant policy debate for many Americans. It had become a national exhaustion. Picture the Capitol after one of those enormous gatherings. The speeches have ended. The microphones are being taken down. The crowd thins in streams, people walking toward buses, train stations, church basements, borrowed floors, and cars parked far away. The grass is trampled. Paper cups, leaflets, candle wax, broken sign handles, cigarette butts, food wrappers, and abandoned newspapers are scattered across the ground. Someone has lost a glove. Someone has left behind a painted sign with words that mattered deeply that morning and now lies face down in the dirt. Police remain at corners, tired and watchful. Sanitation workers begin the unromantic labour that follows public passion. The monuments stand unchanged, which can feel either comforting or cruel, depending on what you had hoped the day would do. This aftermath is worth noticing because history often prefers the crowded hour. It likes the photograph of the march, the aerial view, the famous speaker, the confrontation, the chant, the arrest. But the truth of political action often appears after the crowd goes home. That is when people decide what the day meant. Was it enough? Did it matter? Were they counted? Were they used? Did they feel hope or emptiness on the ride back? Did they return to campus ready to organise more carefully? Or did they return convinced that the system could not be moved by peaceful pressure? Did parents watching on television feel sympathy? Or did they feel more certain that the country was losing control? Did politicians see citizens in pain? Or did they see a public relations problem? The same event could harden every side. Washington, after the crowds left, also revealed the difference between visiting power and living under it. For many white middle-class protesters, the Capitol was a place they entered for a demonstration and then left. For black residents of Washington, it was home, a majority black city governed for much of its history without full democratic self-rule, watched and managed by federal power in ways outsiders did not always understand. The presence of large protest crowds could bring energy and attention, but it could also bring disruption to people whose own struggles were not temporary. Local residents had to navigate police presence, traffic, clean-up, business interruptions, and the strange experience of seeing outsiders use their city as a stage for national conscience. This does not invalidate the protests. It complicates them, and the counterculture often needed that complication. The Poor People's Campaign and Resurrection City in 1968 made that complication visible in a different way. Conceived by Martin Luther King Jr. before his assassination and carried forward afterward, the campaign brought poor Americans of different races to Washington to demand economic justice. They built a temporary encampment on the National Mall, a settlement of plywood structures and tents that became known as Resurrection City. It was not a hippie commune, though some outsiders blurred all forms of protest together. It was a direct challenge to the nation's willingness to tolerate poverty amid abundance. For weeks, people lived there in mud, rain, tension, hope, grief, and organisational difficulty. The sight of poor people living in temporary shelters within view of federal monuments forced Washington to confront poverty not as a statistic, but as a physical presence. Resurrection City also showed how hard it is to sustain moral visibility. The encampment faced weather, internal conflict, public criticism, logistical strain, and federal pressure. Mud became one of its defining images. Mud is not symbolic when you are sleeping in it. It gets into clothes, shoes, bedding, food, tempers, and morale. The campaign asked the nation to look at poverty, but the nation also looked at disorder, discomfort, and administrative difficulty. After the permit expired, authorities cleared the encampment. Washington cleaned the mall again. The poor did not vanish, but their temporary city did. This was another version of the same lesson. A presence could be made visible, but visibility had to be sustained by organisation, resources, and political leverage, or else the Capitol could remove the evidence and resume its routines. For the counterculture, Washington could therefore feel both necessary and disappointing. It was necessary because national power had to be confronted somewhere. It was disappointing because power did not respond like a person being persuaded in a late-night conversation. A president did not simply listen to a song, look out the window at a crowd, and change policy because the moral atmosphere had shifted. Administrations calculated, delayed, negotiated, defended, attacked, and waited for public opinion to move in measurable ways. Protest mattered when it changed the political cost of continuing the war or ignoring demands. But that kind of change was slower and less emotionally satisfying than the crowd experience promised. This gap helped push some activists toward more radical conclusions. If peaceful marches did not stop the war, perhaps stronger tactics were needed. If speeches did not move the government, perhaps disruption would. If the state used violence abroad and police power at home, perhaps appeals to conscience were naive. These arguments grew louder as the decade wore on, especially after assassinations, police confrontations, and continued escalation or expansion of the war. Some groups turned toward militancy, property destruction, or revolutionary rhetoric that alienated many Americans who might otherwise have opposed the war. The counterculture's broad language of refusal began to split into different paths: peaceful reform, electoral politics, community building, spiritual retreat, cultural experimentation, and violent fantasy or action. Washington revealed those divisions because it put the question plainly: what do you do when the crowd leaves and the government continues? The answer for many was to keep organising. That should not be lost beneath the drama. Movements are not made only by famous marches. They are made by people who copy flyers, arrange buses, raise bail money, hold meetings, call reporters, write newsletters, register voters, comfort frightened parents, visit prisoners, collect medical supplies, speak in church basements, and show up again after disappointment. The counterculture is often remembered through style and spectacle, but the anti-war movement depended on unglamorous labour. Someone had to reserve rooms. Someone had to negotiate permits. Someone had to train marshals. Someone had to print maps. Someone had to count money in the envelopes. Someone had to answer phones. Someone had to clean up after the meeting ended. The dream of spontaneous uprising required a great deal of administrative work. Women often did much of that work, and again the contradiction is revealing. In Washington crowds, men frequently took microphones and became visible voices of resistance. Women typed statements, coordinated logistics, fed people, managed offices, and handled the emotional maintenance of movements that did not always credit them. This was true in civil rights organising, anti-war work, student movements, and countercultural communities. The more women noticed it, the more feminism became unavoidable. After the crowd went home, who cleaned the office? Who answered the letters? Who remembered who needed a place to sleep? Who did the work that made the public moment possible? The answer often exposed the limits of male liberation. For ordinary Americans watching Washington demonstrations on television, the aftermath had its own meaning. They did not see every careful organiser or every prayerful marcher. They often saw selected images: the largest crowd, the strangest clothing, the angriest chant, the police line, the arrest, the flag, the sign most likely to provoke a reaction. Television compressed complexity into scenes. A viewer already sympathetic to the movement might see courage and moral urgency. A viewer already hostile might see disorder and disrespect. A viewer uncertain might be moved one day and repelled the next. The battle over interpretation became as important as the event itself. Washington was not only a physical stage, it was a televised stage, and television turned every protest into material for national argument. The Nixon administration understood this terrain. Nixon's political strength grew in part from speaking to Americans who felt ignored by the visible turbulence of the era. He presented himself as the voice of order, restraint, patriotism, and the people who did not march. The silent majority was not silent in any absolute sense, but the phrase worked because it gave identity to those who believed the cameras had favoured the loud. After Washington crowds dispersed, Nixon and others could point to the cleanup, the arrests, the disruption, or the most radical slogans and ask whether this was what America wanted. Protesters believed they were revealing the moral failure of the government. Their opponents believed the protests revealed the moral failure of the protesters. The Capitol gave both sides images to use. There is a human sadness in this because many people on both sides were afraid for the country. Anti-war protesters feared that America was losing its soul in Vietnam. Supporters of order feared that America was losing its coherence at home. Civil rights marchers feared that promises delayed would become promises denied. Local Washington residents feared being overlooked in their own city. Soldiers feared being abandoned or condemned. Parents feared losing sons either to the war or to a culture they no longer recognized. Young people feared becoming the adults they distrusted. Washington gathered these fears because it was the place everyone had been taught to imagine as the center of national responsibility. After the crowd went home, Washington did not look defeated. It looked used. That is the word that fits. The mall used by citizens exercising pressure. Streets used by marchers and police. Monuments used as backdrops for competing definitions of America. Churches used as sleeping places. Government buildings used as targets of anger. Television cameras used to transmit meaning. Signs used until they broke. Bodies used up by walking, chanting, waiting, worrying and hoping. The next morning commuters returned. The federal city resumed. But something had happened, even if it was not enough. People who had stood in those crowds carried the memory back with them. They had seen the size of dissent. They had seen the hardness of power. They had learned that America was not one family arguing around one table, but a vast set of strangers trying to force their grief, fear, and hope into public form. For some, the memory of Washington became proof that democracy still had life in it. Citizens could gather, speak, condemn, mourn, and demand. They could stand before monuments and say the country had failed its own ideals. That mattered. For others, Washington became proof that democracy as practiced was too slow, too insulated, too skilled at absorbing dissent without changing. Both lessons came from real experience. The counterculture would carry both forward, and the tension between them would shape what happened next. Because after the marches, after the speeches, after the music, after the buses pulled away and the Capitol cleaned its lawns, the harder questions remained inside the movement itself. What did freedom actually require from a person after the dramatic moment had passed? Could liberation survive routine? Could a movement reject authority without creating new forms of coercion? Could love be free without becoming careless? Could drugs open consciousness without consuming lives? Could men who opposed war learn not to dominate women? Could white rebels against America understand the older rebellions of Black, Native, Latino and Asian American communities without turning them into decoration for their own self-discovery? Could young people break rules without breaking one another? Washington showed the movement facing the state. The next part of the story has to look at what happened when the movement faced itself. The movement facing itself had already learned one of the hardest lessons in American history, that a crowd could gather in the Capitol, speak with moral force, fill the streets, sing until voices cracked, and still have to wait for power to move. Washington had seen many crowds by the 1960s, but there was one day when the crowd carried itself differently, when the city did not simply become a stage for anger or refusal, but a place where discipline, grief, hope, strategy, and pressure were arranged so carefully that even the people watching from far away could feel that something larger than a demonstration was taking place. It was August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And although no single day created the Civil Rights Act, that day became one of the moments that made delay harder to defend. It is important to say that clearly from the beginning. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not emerge because one speech moved the conscience of the nation in a simple, almost magical way. History is rarely that clean. The law came from decades of organising, lawsuits, boycotts, arrests, church meetings, local courage, federal pressure, newspaper coverage, court decisions, labour activism, political bargaining, and the repeated willingness of ordinary black Americans to risk their jobs, homes, safety, and sometimes their lives for rights that had been promised long before. It came from the Montgomery bus boycott. It came from the sit-ins. It came from the freedom rides. It came from children walking into hostile schools under armed protection. It came from the Birmingham campaign, from jail cells, from dogs and fire hoses, from letters written in confinement, from bodies dragged across pavement, from ministers, students, maids, porters, teachers, veterans, sharecroppers, lawyers and teenagers who discovered that the country's conscience often had to be forced awake. The March on Washington did not begin that story. It gathered it into one visible day, and that is what made it powerful. It gathered. Think of the morning first, buses arriving before the heat fully settled over the city, trains unloading people who had travelled through the night, men in suits stepping down beside students in short sleeves, women carrying handbags, lunches, signs, and the careful seriousness of people who know they are part of something that will be remembered whether it succeeds or fails. Church groups, union members, civil rights workers, clergy, entertainers, veterans, teachers, parents, children, and people who had never before travelled far from home, all moving toward the same place. Some came from the deep south, with fresh memories of danger. Some came from northern cities where discrimination wore different clothes but did the same work. Some came from colleges, some from factories, some from local NAACP branches, some from churches where the trip had been discussed for weeks. There were people there who had spent years organising and people who had only recently understood that silence was a choice. Washington was ready and uneasy. Officials worried about violence. Businesses closed or prepared for trouble. Hospitals made plans. Police were stationed. The National Guard was nearby. The Kennedy administration, which had only recently sent civil rights legislation to Congress after the violence in Birmingham and the moral shock that followed, watched the march with a mixture of support, anxiety, and calculation. The organisers knew that too. They understood that one broken window, one uncontrolled confrontation, one image of chaos could be used by opponents to discredit not only the day but the legislation itself. So the march was planned with extraordinary care. This was not a loose gathering of feeling. It was a disciplined political act. That discipline owed much to Bayard Rustin, one of the most skilled organisers in American history and one of the figures people should know better than they often do. Rustin had spent years in movements for peace, labour, racial justice, and non-violence. He knew logistics the way some people know music. He understood that moral witness required buses, toilets, sound systems, marshals, schedules, medical stations, leaflets, routes, and negotiations. He was also a gay man in a period when that fact could be used brutally against him, and some leaders kept him at a distance publicly because they feared attacks on his sexuality and past political associations. Yet the march depended on his competence. That is one of the quiet patterns of history. The people most necessary to a moment are not always the people later placed at its centre. A. Philip Randolph stood behind the dream of such a march even longer. He had threatened a march on Washington during World War II to pressure President Franklin Roosevelt over discrimination in defence industries, and that pressure helped produce an executive order against such discrimination. Randolph understood the connection between civil rights and economic justice. That is why the 1963 event was not simply called a March for Freedom. It was a march for jobs and freedom. The word jobs mattered. It reminded the country that segregation was not only about where a person could sit, eat, vote, or attend school. It was also about wages, hiring, unions, poverty, housing, and the economic arrangements that kept many black Americans at the edge of American prosperity. Later memory often softens the march into a dream of racial harmony alone, but the original demand was harder, more practical, and more threatening to the economic order than the softened memory suggests. The crowd moved toward the Lincoln Memorial, and the choice of place carried the weight of a century. Lincoln sat in stone above them, the president associated with emancipation, looking out over a nation that had ended slavery but had not completed freedom. The memorial itself had been the site of earlier symbolic confrontation. In 1939, Marian Anderson had sung there after being denied the chance to perform at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution because she was black. Her voice had risen in that open space before a crowd of tens of thousands, turning exclusion into national witness. By 1963, the memorial already carried memory inside memory. A people denied full belonging came again to the monuments of the Republic and asked the country to listen to its own promises. The crowd was enormous, but size alone does not explain the day. The atmosphere mattered. People who were there often remembered the heat, the waiting, the singing, the sense of being part of a disciplined multitude. There were famous performers and leaders, but there were also thousands of ordinary participants whose names were never recorded. A woman from a church group standing with aching feet. A college student who had spent the bus ride arguing about whether non-violence could survive Southern brutality. A father holding a child up so the child could see over shoulders. A union man who understood that civil rights and labour rights belonged in the same sentence. A black veteran who had worn the uniform of a country that still made him enter certain places through the back. A white minister who had decided that moderation had become another word for waiting. A young person who came because a friend came and left with a different understanding of history. The speeches that day did not all say the same thing. That is another part of the story that gets flattened. The movement was not one mind. It contained older leaders and young radicals, integrationists and nationalists, labour organisers and ministers, cautious strategists and impatient students. John Lewis, then chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, prepared a speech that criticised the Civil Rights Bill as too weak and questioned the federal government's failure to protect people in the South. Some of his original language alarmed other leaders and church officials, and he revised it under pressure. Even in its softened form, his speech carried the impatience of young activists who had faced violence directly and were tired of appeals to gradual change. That tension between respectability and militancy, between broad coalition and sharp truth, did not begin later in the decade. It was present on the platform that day. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke near the end, and his speech became the memory through which many Americans later understood the entire march. That is understandable. It was a remarkable speech, carefully built from constitutional promise, biblical cadence, black church tradition, American civic language, and the repeated insistence that the nation had defaulted on a debt owed to its black citizens. The most famous portion, the dream sequence, was partly familiar from King's earlier speeches, but on that day it expanded into something that could travel beyond the crowd. Yet even here we must be careful. The speech was not merely a gentle wish for children to hold hands someday. It was a demand for justice now. It spoke of bad checks, fierce urgency, police brutality, blocked mobility, and the refusal to be satisfied while basic rights were denied. The dream came after indictment. Without the indictment, the dream becomes decoration. People listening in the crowd heard it in the heat, surrounded by bodies, near the memorial after hours of speeches and songs. People watching at home heard it through television, framed by the authority of the national screen. That difference matters. For those present, the speech was part of a full day of labour, travel, risk, waiting, and collective discipline. For television viewers, it entered the living room as a moral event. A white family in the Midwest or Northeast might see not disorder but dignity. A politician might see not a small group of agitators but a national constituency. A hesitant supporter of civil rights might feel the ground shift, not because prejudice vanished, but because opposition to the movement became harder to present as defence of order. The march showed order. It showed seriousness. It showed patriotism in the form of demand. This was one of its great strategic achievements. Opponents of civil rights often tried to portray the movement as dangerous, radical, outside agitation meant to disrupt a stable society. The March on Washington made that portrayal harder for many viewers to accept. Here was a mass gathering in the Capitol, interracial, disciplined, organised, filled with American flags, songs, prayers and appeals to founding promises. It did not look like an invasion of America. It looked like America confronting itself. That did not persuade everyone. Segregationists did not watch King speak and surrender their worldview. Many white Americans remained hostile, frightened or resentful. But the march changed the public picture. It gave supporters of civil rights a powerful image to carry into the legislative fight. The legislative fight was already underway. In June 1963, after Birmingham forced the issue into national urgency, President Kennedy had addressed the nation and framed civil rights as a moral question, not merely a regional or legal problem. He proposed legislation that would become the foundation of the Civil Rights Act. But Kennedy's bill faced serious opposition in Congress, especially from Southern Democrats who had long used procedural power to block civil rights laws. The March on Washington took place in that tense space between proposal and passage. It did not pass the bill. It added pressure. It reminded Washington that people were watching, travelling, organising, and demanding more than sympathy. Then, less than 3 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. The country entered one of those stunned periods when public time seems to stop and private rooms become places of national grief. Lyndon B. Johnson became president, a man very different from Kennedy in style, background, and political method. Johnson understood Congress with a depth Kennedy did not. He knew the egos, rules, weaknesses, debts, fears, ambitions, and pressure points of legislators because he had spent years mastering them. After Kennedy's death, Johnson used the fallen president's memory and his own formidable political skill to push civil rights legislation forward. He framed passage as a tribute to Kennedy, but it was also a test of the nation and of his own presidency. The struggle in Congress was long and bitter. Southern opponents resisted with every tool available, including one of the longest filibusters in Senate history. The debate was not polite disagreement over minor language. It was a fight over the legal architecture of segregation and discrimination. The bill aimed to outlaw segregation in public accommodations, strengthen the federal government's ability to enforce school desegregation, prohibit discrimination in programs receiving federal assistance, and address employment discrimination through what became Title VII. To supporters, this was a necessary federal response to a century of evasion and abuse. To opponents, it was federal overreach, social revolution, and an attack on local control. The language of local control had long served as a shield for racial inequality. The Civil Rights Act challenged that shield directly. When the bill finally passed and Johnson signed it on July 2, 1964, the moment carried the weight of all the moments that had led to it. The signing ceremony produced its own photographs, its own official memory, its own sense of achievement. King was there. Leaders were there. Pens were handed out as tokens. The president spoke. The machinery of government, so slow and frustrating to movements outside it, had finally produced a law of enormous consequence. It was a victory, and it should be called one. But no one who understood the struggle could mistake signing for completion. A law can open doors. It cannot instantly change hearts, local practices, economic inequalities, school systems, police behaviour, housing markets, or the daily habits by which discrimination survives after it becomes illegal. This is where the echo of that August day becomes more complicated. The March on Washington echoed into the Civil Rights Act, but the Act also echoed back into the movement by proving both the possibility and the limits of federal reform. It showed that mass pressure, moral argument, legal strategy, and political negotiation could produce national change. That mattered deeply. But it also showed that even great legislation left enormous work undone. Voting rights still needed a separate and ferocious struggle, one that would move through Selma and lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Economic justice remained far more difficult. Northern segregation, housing discrimination, police brutality, unemployment, poverty, and school inequality could not be solved simply by removing signs from lunch counters or hotel lobbies. The movement had won a major battle, but the country had not become just. For the young people of the 1960s, this lesson shaped everything that followed. The Civil Rights Act proved that America could be forced to change. That was inspiring. It also proved how much force had been required to make the country honour rights it already claimed to believe in. That was enraging. A student watching the bill pass might feel hope. A civil rights worker who had been beaten might feel relief mixed with exhaustion. A black family in the South might test the new law cautiously, knowing that paper rights and local safety were not the same thing. A segregationist might begin looking for new ways to preserve old hierarchies under different names. A white moderate might congratulate the country and assume the problem was solved. The same law entered different lives in very different ways. The counterculture drew from this moment even when it did not fully understand its source. White student activists learned that public pressure could matter. Anti-war organisers learned from civil rights tactics, marches, sit-ins, non-violent confrontation, jail solidarity, media strategy, moral witness. Feminists learned from the gap between public ideals and private inequality. Chicano, Native, Asian American, and gay liberation movements learned from and adapted the language of rights, pride, direct action, and institutional challenge. But there was also tension. Some later countercultural rebels treated civil rights as part of a general story of liberation, without always respecting the specific black history, danger, discipline, and sacrifice that made the movement possible. They borrowed methods, songs, language, and moral authority from a struggle that had cost others far more than it cost many of them. That borrowing could create resentment, and understandably so. A white college student could join an anti-war march and return to campus with bruises, a story, and perhaps parental disapproval. A black activist in Mississippi or Alabama might face murder, eviction, job loss, church bombing, or the permanent hostility of local officials. The risks were not equal. The moral seriousness of the civil rights movement came partly from the fact that it confronted a system that governed every hour of life. The counterculture sometimes turned rebellion into a matter of self-expression. Civil rights workers knew rebellion as a matter of survival. When those worlds met, they could strengthen each other, but they could also misunderstand each other deeply. The March on Washington itself held some of that tension in its full title, Jobs and Freedom, and popular memory tends to preserve freedom more easily than jobs because freedom can be turned into a beautiful word and placed on posters. Jobs require arguments about wages, unions, budgets, discrimination in hiring, public investment, and economic power. Randolph and other organisers did not separate dignity from material life. A person needed the right to sit at a lunch counter, but also the money to buy the meal. A person needed access to a hotel, but also work that paid enough to travel. A person needed legal equality, but also schools, housing, health, and safety. The Civil Rights Act addressed crucial forms of legal discrimination, but the economic demands remained only partly answered. That unfinished business would haunt the rest of the decade. After the Act passed, public accommodations began changing, though not evenly and not without resistance. Hotels, restaurants, theatres, and other businesses covered by the law could no longer legally exclude people on the basis of race. Employers faced new legal constraints on discrimination. The federal government had stronger tools. These changes mattered in daily life. A black traveller entering a restaurant that would once have refused service was not experiencing an abstraction. A worker challenging discrimination was not living inside a slogan. Law can feel distant until it alters the ordinary humiliations of a day. The Civil Rights Act entered history not only through court cases and textbooks, but through doors opened, seats taken, applications filed, complaints made, and acts of courage that continued because enforcement often required people to test the law. Resistance adapted. Some businesses complied reluctantly, others tried to evade. Some white communities withdrew into private clubs, suburban boundaries, school district lines, and political language that avoided open racial terms while defending racial outcomes. The end of legal segregation in one sphere did not end segregation as a social project. It changed the battlefield. This is one reason the late 1960s became more radical. For many activists, the early victories revealed deeper structures. If public accommodations could be desegregated and still poverty remained, then racism was more than signs and counters. If voting rights could be passed and still police violence continued, then democracy required more than ballots. If legal equality could advance while cities remained unequal, then freedom needed economic and institutional transformation. That realization pushed different parts of the movement in different directions. Some continued legal and legislative work. Some focused on voter registration, community organizing, schools, housing, and local power. Some turned toward black power, arguing that integration into existing institutions was not enough, and that black communities needed self-determination, pride, and control over their own political and economic life. Some white liberals were startled by this shift because they had preferred a movement that appealed to their conscience without threatening their power. But for many black activists, the move was not a rejection of freedom. It was a demand that freedom be defined by those who had been denied it. The counterculture watched and absorbed parts of this shift too. The idea that oppressed people should define their own liberation influenced women's liberation, gay liberation, native activism, Chicano activism, and student movements. Identity, pride, community control, and suspicion of establishment authority all became central to the politics that followed. But again, the borrowing was uneven. White countercultural spaces sometimes celebrated black music, black style, and black radical language while remaining largely white in practice. They admired resistance, but did not always confront segregation within their own lives. They spoke of universal freedom while benefiting from particular privileges. The echo of the civil rights struggle into the counterculture was therefore both fruitful and uncomfortable. Return for a moment to the day itself, because the day is still there beneath the legislation and everything that came after. The sun over Washington, the long wait, the crowd near the reflecting pool, the voices rising and fading, the signs held above heads, the marshals keeping order, the officials watching nervously, the reporters searching for the right angle, the singers carrying sound across the open air, the leaders at the microphone, the ordinary people who had come too far to be told patience was a virtue. The feeling, for some, that America might be capable of hearing the truth if the truth were spoken clearly enough in the shadow of its own monuments. Then the buses left. The city quieted. People returned to homes where discrimination still waited. They returned to towns where sheriffs still knew their names. They returned to offices where legislators counted votes. They returned to campuses where students replayed what they had seen. They returned to churches where the next meeting had already been scheduled. The day did not end when the crowd dispersed. It entered memory, strategy, and pressure. It became a reference point. It became something politicians had to account for. It became something children would later see in school books, though often in a softened form. It became part of the moral atmosphere in which the Civil Rights Act could no longer be postponed without cost. The danger of famous days is that they can make change look inevitable. The March on Washington now appears in history as if it were always destined to be honoured. It was not. It could have been dismissed. It could have been marred by violence. It could have been used against the movement. The Civil Rights Act could have failed, weakened beyond recognition, or been delayed again. The people who marched did not know the ending. They walked into uncertainty. That is what gives the day its real weight. Historical courage does not come from knowing the future will praise you. It comes from acting when the future is undecided, and perhaps that is why the day echoed so strongly into the decade of rebellion that followed. It showed that public moral action could reshape the national imagination, but it also showed that imagination had to be forced into law, and law had to be forced into practice. The counterculture would often prefer transformation to procedure, experience to legislation, authenticity to negotiation. Yet the Civil Rights Act proved that procedure mattered, votes mattered, committees mattered, filibusters mattered, legal language mattered, enforcement mechanisms mattered. The state could be an instrument of oppression, but it could also be pressured into becoming an instrument against certain forms of oppression. That was a lesson more complicated than simple rebellion allowed. For young Americans watching, the day and the law together offered a model and a challenge. If a disciplined movement could confront segregation and help produce federal legislation, what else could be challenged? The war, universities, gender roles, sexual laws, police power, poverty, corporate life, the family itself. The answer that many drew was yes. But the civil rights struggle also asked whether those later rebellions would have the patience, discipline, courage and moral clarity required to change more than style. Some did, some did not. The difference mattered. The Civil Rights Act stands, then, not as the end of the story, but as one of the great hinges of the 1960s. Before it, the country could still pretend with more ease that its racial order was a regional problem, a slow problem, a problem best handled later by local people. After it, federal law declared that certain forms of exclusion were no longer compatible with American citizenship. That declaration did not complete justice, but it changed the legal and moral terrain on which every later movement stood. The Counterculture's rebellion against America unfolded in the shadow of that change. It inherited the proof that America could be challenged successfully, and the proof that success would always be partial. So when we look back at that day in Washington, we should not see only the dream. Though the dream matters, we should see the work behind the dream. The buses, the organisers, the revised speeches, the old labour demands, the young impatience, the federal anxiety, the television cameras, the songs, the heat, the tired feet, the strategic discipline, the arguments hidden behind unity, and the long legislative struggle that followed. We should see the people who went home and kept working after the beautiful day was over. We should see the law signed almost a year later, and the lives that still had to be lived under its promises. We should see how a gathering can become pressure, how pressure can become law, and how law can become another beginning rather than an ending. Because the generation that rebelled against America did not rebel in a vacuum. It came of age while the civil rights movement was teaching the country what organised moral pressure looked like. It watched black Americans and their allies force the federal government to act. It saw that the public square could become a classroom, a courtroom, a church, and a battlefield all at once. It learned that songs could carry demands, that bodies could make injustice visible, that television could bring a movement into homes that might never welcome the marchers themselves, and that the distance between a day in Washington and a president's signature was filled with struggle. That lesson did not belong only to one movement, but it was paid for most dearly by the people who had fought longest, for the basic right to be treated as citizens in the country they had built. And as the decade moved forward, the question became what younger rebels would do with that inheritance. Would they carry its discipline or only its drama? Would they understand its sacrifices or only borrow its language? Would they build coalitions that reach beyond youth culture? Or would they mistake their own freedom for the whole of freedom? The Civil Rights Act had shown that America could be changed by pressure from below and action from above. It had also shown how much pain was required before the country admitted what should have been obvious. That knowledge settled into the 1960s like a charge in the air, and every movement that followed had to breathe it in.